They threw him out of a $5 million ballroom because his suit was wrinkled. Security guards gripped his arms. Hundreds of the city's wealthiest people watched. A billionaire CEO pointed at the door and didn't blink. And as they dragged him across that polished marble floor past the champagne, past the chandelier light, past every person who'd already decided he was nobody, he looked back at a little girl who was about to die. He said 4 words. Nobody listened. 20 minutes later, that same room was screaming. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now. And don't you dare leave before this story is finished. Drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And if something in this hits you, give it a like. You'll understand why before we're done. The Sterling Crown Hotel had a way of making people feel small. It was, of course, entirely by design. The ceilings climbed 4 stories above the ballroom floor, each inch of plasterwork, gilded and carved into patterns that most guests never looked at closely enough to appreciate, not because they lacked the taste, but because they were too busy watching each other. The chandeliers were original, shipped from a demolished Viennese estate in 987, and reassembled piece by piece over the course of 2 weeks by a team of specialists flown in from overseas. The marble beneath everyone's shoes was Italian. The floral arrangements on each table had been designed by a woman who charged more per event than most families made in a year, and she'd spent 3 days getting the white peonies right. Everything in that room had been chosen to communicate something. Power, precision, the particular kind of confidence that comes not from earning money, but from never having had to wonder where it was coming from. The Westlake Pediatric Cardiac Gala was, by any reasonable measure, a success before it even began. 412 guests had confirmed attendance. The auction items alone, a private island weekend, a vintage wine collection, a commissioned portrait by an artist whose waiting list stretched 3 years, were expected to raise close to $800,000 before dinner was served. The foundation's public relations teams had already drafted the press release. Record-breaking year it began. Audrey Westlake stood near the east windows with a glass of sparkling water she hadn't touched and watched the room fill. He'd intervened. She was 30 years old. She'd been running Westlake Capital for 4 years, since her father's stroke had made it necessary, and she had not once in those 4 years allowed the company to move sideways, only forward. Her photograph had appeared on the covers of 3 national business publications in the past 18 months. She wore a navy gown tonight that had been fitted twice, her dark hair pulled back in a way that was elegant without appearing to have required any effort, and she spoke to the guests, who approached her with exactly the warmth that the situation required, never more, never less. People who didn't know Audrey Westlake sometimes mistook her composure for coldness. People who did know her understood it differently. She was a woman who had learned very early that the moment you showed fear, someone would use it. Tonight, underneath all of it, the gown, the composure, the careful smile, she was doing what she always did at these events. She was watching Maisie. Maisie Westlake was 9 years old, and Maisie Westlake was a particular gift of children who have spent significant time around adults. She was comfortable in rooms that would have intimidated most people her age, and she had no idea how unusual that was. She moved through the ballroom with her small shoulders straight, her dark curls pinned back with a clip shaped like a butterfly, wearing a white dress with a sash the color of forget-me-nots. She had her mother's eyes. She had her father's laugh, or so Audrey was told, by people who had known him. Maisie had been 2 years old when he died, and she did not remember him, which was something Audrey carried quietly and never discussed. Maisie also carried, quietly and without complaint, was a heart that had never worked quite the way it was supposed to. She'd been diagnosed at 4 days old. The cardiologist who delivered the news had been gentle, thorough, and honest. In the way that the best physicians manage, he'd told Audrey everything she needed to know without stripping away the hope she needed to function. The condition was serious. It was manageable. There would be surgeries, monitoring, medication adjustments, careful attention to certain warning signs. Maisie had already had 2 procedures by the time she was 6. A third was being discussed for the following spring. She was not fragile exactly, but she required vigilance. And so Audrey had built vigilance into every corner of their lives. There were two physicians at the gala tonight, specifically because Maisie was attending Dr. Nada Osi and Dr. Paul Firth, both cardiologists, both known to Audrey personally and trusted completely. There were 4 members of private security who knew Maisie's medical history. Audrey's personal assistant had a laminated card in her jacket pocket with emergency protocols. The nearest hospital was 7 minutes away, by the route their driver had pre-mapped. Every variable had been accounted for. Audrey watched Maisie accept a glass of sparkling juice from a passing server and say something that made the server laugh, and felt the tension in her chest ease by one precise degree. She was safe. She was fine. She always was. Grant Holloway arrived at 7:43 p.m., 17 minutes after the event officially began, because he'd had to stop twice on the drive over to review the directions. He didn't own a GPS device, and his phone was 3 generations old. The screen cracked in the lower left corner from the time Piper had dropped it down the back steps trying to photograph a bird. He parked 2 blocks away because the valet made him uncomfortable, not embarrassed. Exactly. Just uncomfortable in the specific way that comes from knowing someone is going to look at your car and think something you can't control. The car was a 2009 Chevy Impala with a dent in the rear quarter panel and a pine tree air freshener hanging from the mirror. It ran fine. It had always run fine. Grant was meticulous about the things that mattered. He walked the 2 blocks in his navy suit, which was the suit he wore to job interviews, to school concerts, and to the 2 funerals he'd attended in the last 4 years. It was clean and pressed, because Grant ironed his own clothes on Sunday evenings, while Piper sat on the kitchen counter doing her spelling homework. But it was also 7 years old. 7 years was long enough for a suit to look like what it was, something that belonged to a man who needed a suit twice a year and couldn't justify spending money on a new one. He'd been invited tonight because Piper was singing with the children's choir. That was the whole reason. He had not been invited because of any connection to the foundation or to anyone in that room. Had connection. He ran inventory management for a regional hardware supply company. He drove Piper to school every morning, packed lunch, always with a folded paper note inside. A habit he'd started when she was in kindergarten and never stopped, and picked her up every afternoon, unless his shift ran long, in which case his neighbor, Mrs. Pacheco, sat with her until he got home. His life was small by the measurements most of the people inside the Sterling Crown Hotel used to measure lives, and he had made his peace with that. Or rather, he didn't think about it very often, which wasn't quite the same thing. He showed his invitation at the door, a paper one, printed at the public library, because he didn't own a printer either, and was admitted by a young man in a suit that probably cost more than Grant's monthly rent. The young man's eyes traveled over Grant once, quickly and professionally, in the way that people do when they're trained to assess threat levels and have accidentally started doing it with everything. Grant noticed. He didn't react. He'd been noticed like that before. Inside, he stood near the back of the ballroom for a while, getting his bearings. The scale of it was something he hadn't anticipated, though he probably should have. The Sterling Crown had been visible from the highway for 20 years, and Grant had driven past it hundreds of times, without ever thinking about what the inside looked like. Now he knew. It looked like a room designed by someone who wanted you to feel, at all times, that you were slightly beneath it. He found the area set aside for the children's choir, a roped section near the east side of the room, where a handler from the music program was arranging 30-odd children in rows by height. Piper spotted him from 40 feet away and raised her hand in the careful wave of a child who is trying very hard to be grown-up and professional about this whole thing. Grant raised his hand back. She dropped her wave immediately and looked at the ceiling in the precise manner of an 8-year-old who has just been made aware that she almost did something babyish in public. He smiled. He found a spot where he could see the choir section without being in anyone's way, and stood there with his hands in his pockets, watching Piper argue quietly with the boy beside her about something involving their placement in the row. Was when he saw the girl by the staircase. She was standing at the base of the grand staircase on the north side of the ballroom, partially separated from the main cluster of guests, and she was the kind of pale that has a particular quality to it, not the pale of someone who is cold or tired or fair-skinned. The pale of someone whose blood is not going where it needs to go. Grant had seen that color before, not in a ballroom. Other places entirely, where the floors were not marble and the lighting was not chandeliers and nobody was wearing a dress that cost more than a car. He watched her for 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, he noted the way her left hand had come up to press, almost absently, against the center of her chest, as though she was trying to hold something in place. The way her breathing had changed, shallow, labored, the slight flare of her nostrils. No, that meant she was working harder than she should have been just to pull in air. The way she leaned, fractionally, against the banister, and how her weight shifted to accommodate something her body was doing without her permission. 9, maybe 10. White dress, blue sash, dark curls. Grant moved toward her. He was not a man who second-guessed himself in emergencies. This was not arrogance, he had earned it, the hard way, in circumstances he never described in detail and rarely thought about if he could help it. He moved across the ballroom floor with the kind of directness that has no aggression in it, that is simply the physical expression of a decision already made. And he was perhaps 15 feet from the girl when he heard a voice. "Excuse me." It was not a question. Audrey Westlake had tracked him from the moment she noticed him moving toward Maisie with purpose. She did not know who he was. She knew what he was wearing. She knew he was moving too directly and too fast toward her daughter. And she knew, with the absolute certainty of a woman who had built her entire life around protecting one small person, that this was not acceptable. Grant stopped. He looked at her. "Your daughter," he said, keeping his voice low and level, "needs security." Audrey said it without raising her voice, and the 2 men near the pillar were moving before the word was finished. Grant held up one hand. "Please, just look at her." Her lips, "I asked you to step back." One of the security men, tall, broad, with the professionally blank face of someone who has removed people from nice places many times and feels nothing particular about it, put a hand on Grant's arm. "Her color is wrong." Grant did not raise his voice. He did not try to pull away. He looked past the security man at Audrey directly, with the kind of eye contact that some people find uncomfortable because it contains no performance in it whatsoever. "I understand you don't know me. I understand how this looks. But something is happening with her heart, and you have maybe 10 minutes before. Get him out." Audrey's voice was steady, her eyes were not, because she had looked at Maisie, and she had seen for just a second before she stopped herself exactly what he was describing. No, but the room was full of doctors. The room was full of people who knew Maisie's history. The room was full of security and physicians and protocols. And this man in his wrinkled suit with his cracked phone and his 2-block walk from wherever he parked was a stranger who had moved toward her daughter with a kind of certainty she did not trust and could not explain. She told herself, "The doctors are watching her. They would have said something." She told herself, "This is exactly the kind of thing that I have prepared for. I am prepared." The security men were already moving Grant toward the doors, on each arm, and he was letting them, because Grant Holloway understood certain things about situations, and one of them was the difference between a battle you could win and one you couldn't. But at the marble threshold, before the doors swung open behind him, he stopped and turned back. 400 people in the room. Crystal glasses catching the chandelier light. The orchestra playing something quiet and civilized near the far wall. Maisie at the base of the stairs, still pressing her hand against her chest, and now he could see her eyes had gone slightly glassy, a distance in them that hadn't been there before. Grant looked at Audrey across the crowded, glittering room. "Your daughter needs help," he said now. The doors opened. He was outside. The sidewalk in front of the Sterling Crown was empty, yes, except for the valet stand and 2 smokers who had stepped out from a different event on the hotel's lower level. The city went about its business, 20 feet away cabs, a delivery truck, a couple walking a dog who pulled toward a fire hydrant with the urgency of a dog who has been waiting a very long time. Grant stood on the sidewalk and breathed. His jaw was tight. He loosened it deliberately, the way you learn to control physical responses when physical responses are liabilities. He looked at the doors. He thought of Piper inside. He thought about Piper, about the way she'd practiced Danny Boy every night for 3 weeks until she could get through the whole thing without her voice cracking on the high note. He thought about the note in her lunchbox that morning which had said, "I'll be the loudest one clapping. Love, Dad." He thought about the little girl with the blue sash. He pulled out his phone and looked at Piper's photograph. It was the lock screen, a picture from last summer at the state fair. Piper holding a stick of cotton candy, taller than her head and laughing with her whole face, and he stood there on the sidewalk and made a decision. He had made harder ones. He went back inside. The security man at the door recognized him immediately and stepped forward, but Grant's voice was already past him. "There's a medical emergency happening right now in your ballroom." He said it with the specific calm of someone who is not panicking, which paradoxically is what makes people listen. "I need you to get me back in there, sir. I'm going to have to ask you to." The screaming started. It was not dramatic, movie-style screaming. It was the sudden, involuntary kind. The sound that comes out of a room full of people when something impossible happens in front of them, when the framework of an evening breaks without warning and nobody knows what to do with the pieces. It was sharp and then immediately confused and then loud in a way that had texture to it. Many voices overlapping, and Grant was already moving before the security man could process what was happening. He didn't push anyone. He moved through the crowd the way water moves, finding the gaps, adjusting constant pressure applied with precision rather than force. And he was at Maisie's side in 45 seconds. She was on the floor. She had gone down against the banister, which had broken her fall. She wasn't hurt from the fall itself, but she was unconscious, her breathing audible now, in a way breathing should never be audible. And the color of her lips had moved into territory that Grant recognized immediately and filed away without emotion. Dr. Osei was there, on her knees, already running through assessment. Dr. Firth was 30 seconds behind her. Around them, a circle had formed, the particular circle that crowds make in emergencies, close enough to watch, far enough to tell themselves they were giving the professionals room. Audrey was on the floor beside Maisie with her hands hovering, not touching, because there was nothing for her hands to do. Grant knelt on the opposite side of Maisie from Dr. Osei. "I'm not a threat." He said it directly, looking at the doctor. "Tell me what you're seeing." Dr. Osei looked up sharply. "Who are you? Tell me what you're seeing." He didn't repeat the first part. Something in his voice, the lack of performance in it, the total absence of any desire to be impressive, made her answer instead of asking again. "Arrhythmia. She has a history of SVT. She's had 2 prior procedures I'm seeing. Is she in VT right now?" A pause. The pause lasted less than 2 seconds. "No yet. She's going to be." Grant had his fingers on Maisie's wrist, not pressing hard, reading. Her pulse is irregular, and it's been deteriorating for at least the last 12 to 15 minutes. The way she was standing before she went down, she was compensating. Her body was working to stay upright. He looked up at Dr. Firth, who had arrived and was opening a medical bag. "You have the capability to monitor her rhythm?" "We have a portable monitor." "Yes." "Get it on her, right now." There was a beat the beat that happens when someone with authority in a room suddenly realizes that the person giving orders is not who they expected the person giving orders to be. Then Dr. Firth reached for the monitor. "You need to call the paramedics," Grant said to no one in particular, meaning everyone in earshot. "She needs a cardiac team. This room has everything she needs for the next 4 to 6 minutes, and then it doesn't." Audrey was looking at him. She was still on the floor beside Maisie, and her hands had finally settled one on Maisie's arm, gentle, the way a mother's hands know where to go without being told, and she was looking at Grant, the way you look at something you're not certain is real. He didn't look back at her. He was watching Maisie. "Talk to her," he said quietly, directed at Audrey. Her mother's voice. "It matters right now. Talk to her." Audrey opened her mouth, closed it, swallowed. "Maisie," her voice came out wrong, too thin, too high. She tried again. "Maisie, baby. I'm right here, okay? You're going to be okay?" Maisie did not respond, but something in the tension of her small face changed, fractionally, way things do when a sound reaches somewhere even a sleeping or unconscious person lives. The portable monitor registered its first reading. Dr. Osei looked at the screen. She looked at Grant. "You were right," she said. It came out quiet, and it cost her nothing, because Dr. Renato Osei was an excellent physician, and excellent physicians don't let ego get in the way of what's in front of them. "Her rhythm is, I know." Grant's voice was even. "They need to know that before they get here." Call it in now so they're ready when they come through the door. Firth was already on the phone. Around them, the ballroom had gone the particular kind of quiet that feels nothing like quiet, the tight, held-breath silence of 400 people who are frightened and don't know what to do with it. Yes, he'd intervened. Grant Holloway knelt on the Italian marble in his 7-year-old suit and did not think about the fact that 20 minutes ago he had been dragged out of this room in front of every single one of them. Yes, he'd intervened. He thought about the angle of Maisie's chin, and her breathing, and what the monitor was telling him, and what the paramedics would need when they came through those doors. That was all. Piper had seen her father come back in. She'd seen him go out too, which Sadiv frightened her in a way she didn't have language. For yet the sight of her father being moved through a room by men who were larger than him, her father who was the largest thing in her world, her father who fixed things. She'd watched from the choir section with the particular frozen stillness of a child who understands something is wrong, but has been taught not to cause a scene, was a thing her father had gently taught her, because he was a man who had spent a great deal of time in situations where causing a scene made things worse. She watched him come back in through the same doors he'd been walked out of, and she watched the way he moved when he moved toward the staircase, and she recognized that movement. She'd seen it once before, 2 years ago, when a man had collapsed outside the grocery store, and her father had left their cart in the middle of the aisle without a word and gone outside. She'd been 6 then. She hadn't understood. She was 8 now, and she understood enough. Piper stood in her spot in the second row of the choir and sang Danny Boy, because that is what she had practiced, and because her father had told her, more than once, that you don't stop doing what you're supposed to do, just because something scary is happening nearby. You keep your head and you do your job, he had said. In the particular way he sometimes said things that she knew from somewhere before she existed. Everything else gets handled after. Her voice cracked on the high note anyway. She wasn't sure her father heard it. He wasn't looking at her, but that was okay. She knew why. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes, which was 4 minutes longer than 7, because the pre-mapped route had a delivery truck blocking the intersection at 5th and Halden, and the driver had to reroute. Later, someone would argue that those 4 minutes had mattered. Someone else would argue they hadn't. Grant did not weigh in on that argument. What he knew and what he did not say, because it was not a thing that needed to be said out loud. The 4 minutes had mattered, and the reason they hadn't cost Maisie her life, someone had identified what was happening before she went down and communicated it clearly to the physicians who were already there. Someone. He stepped back when the paramedics took over. Far back, he stayed close enough to answer questions, and the lead paramedic, a woman named Torres who had 15 years in, and the brusque efficiency that came with it, asked him 2 direct questions when she saw how he'd positioned Maisie and how the monitor had been set up. "Who are you?" she asked. Her tone was not unfriendly. It was the tone of someone who needs information and doesn't have time for anything but the information. "I'm no one," Grant said. "Just someone who saw her before she went down." Torres gave him a look that said she didn't entirely believe this, but had more important things to do than press it. Moved Maisie to the gurney. The circle of guests parted, and in the parting there was a quality to the silence that was different from what it had been before, something heavier in it. Something that a room of people makes when they are confronting something they had not expected to confront inside a place designed for precisely the opposite. Audrey stood up from the floor. She was, Grant observed, not composed. She was trying to be, because it was what she knew how to do, and because there was still a room full of people, and because Audrey Westlake had trained herself over many years to be composed in public, regardless of the cost. But there were limits to what training could do, and the limit tonight was visible in the way she held her own arms, crossed over her chest, her hands gripping her own elbows, like they needed something to hold on to. She did not look at Grant. She followed the gurney. Grant watched her go. He went and found Piper. The choir handler, a young woman named Becca, who had been managing the children through the entire incident with admirable, calm, and terrible visible anxiety. Her professional composure, approximately one thin layer over outright panic, was already grouping the kids together and speaking to a cluster of parents who had rushed over. Piper was standing slightly apart from the group, watching the direction her father had come from. When she saw him, her face did the thing it did, a brief, total drop of the careful self-possession she'd been maintaining, a flash of something pure and unguarded, and then it was back, her chin up, her expression attempting to be an 8-year-old's best impression of "I was fine" the whole time. Grant crouched in front of her. "Hey, hi." Her voice came out smaller than she'd intended. She cleared her throat, the little girl. "Is she okay?" "She's going to the hospital. She's going to be looked after." Piper processed this for a moment. "You helped her." Some. More than some." She said it with a certainty that was not childlike at all, and Grant had one of those moments they happened sometimes, more often as she got older, where he looked at his daughter and understood that she was watching him as carefully as he had ever watched anything, and that she was filing everything away, and that the person she was becoming was being assembled, in part, from what she observed. That thought was not comfortable. It had never been comfortable. He had learned to carry it. "I heard you singing," he said. "The Danny boy." She looked at him. "No, you didn't. You weren't looking at me." "I was listening." He paused. "You hit the note." Her mouth twitched. It cracked. It did a little. "Don't tell anyone." "I already forgot about it," he said. She leaned into him then, just slightly, not dramatically, with tears. Just the small, specific weight of a child, pressing against the thing in their world that doesn't move. And Grant put his arm around her shoulders and stood there in the ballroom of the Sterling Crown Hotel, while the guests around them slowly reformed into something resembling an evening, and the orchestra played something they probably hadn't been planning to play. And the overhead lights came back up after someone had apparently dimmed them during the emergency, without anyone quite noticing when. He should go, he thought. There was nothing more for him to do here. His suit was fine. He was fine. Piper was fine. He stayed another few minutes anyway, because his car was 2 blocks away and the night air was cold, and Piper had not let go of his arm yet, and he was in no hurry to make her. Later, much later, after Piper was asleep in the back seat, during the drive home, her choir dress still on, because she'd refused to change at the hotel, and he hadn't pushed it, Grant thought about the moment at the door. Your daughter needs help. Now, he'd meant it as a warning. He understood, even in the moment, that it had come across as something else, as the parting shot of a man who'd been publicly embarrassed, as the dramatic exit line of someone who wanted the last word. That was the thing about moments like that. You couldn't control what they looked like from the outside. You could only control what you did with the information you had. He had had information. He had used it. Everything after that was other people's business. At a stoplight, he adjusted the rearview mirror and looked at Piper face slack, mouth slightly open, one hand curled under her chin. She'd sleep until he carried her in, and she was getting heavier every year. Next year, she probably wouldn't let him carry her at all anymore. And that thought arrived and departed without him doing anything with it. The light changed. He drove. He did not know, on that drive, that his phone would ring the next morning. He did not know that Audrey Westlake's assistant would be on the line, formal and careful, asking if Mr. Holloway would be willing to come to Merge General to speak with Ms. Mises. Westlake. He did not know that Maisie was awake by the following dawn, asking the nurses if the man who'd been kneeling next to her would be coming back. He did not know any of that. What he knew was the road home, and the weight of his daughter in the seat behind him, and the pine tree air freshener that had long since stopped smelling like anything. He turned onto his street. He parked. He sat in the car for a moment in the dark, listening to Piper breathe. Then he got out, opened the back door and picked her up, and she stirred just enough to put her arms around his neck, and not enough to wake. And he carried her up the front steps of the small house on Delwood Avenue and managed the door without putting her down, which was a thing he had been doing her whole life, and would keep doing for as long as he could. Inside, he left the lights off. He knew where everything was. The call came at 8:47 the next morning. Grant was standing at the kitchen counter eating cereal out of the box because he'd forgotten to buy milk 2 days running, and he almost didn't answer because the number wasn't one he recognized. He had a rule. About unknown numbers, he let them go to voicemail, called back if it mattered, but something made him pick up. He couldn't have said, "What, Mr. Holloway?" The voice on the other end was a woman, professional and measured, the kind of voice that had been trained to deliver information without conveying anything personal about the person delivering it. "My name is Claire Sato. I'm the executive assistant to Audrey Westlake. Miss Westlake would like to know if you'd be available to come to Mercy General Hospital this morning." Set the box of cereal down. "How is she?" he asked. "The girl." There was a brief pause, the kind that happens when someone has been given a script and the first question veers off it. "Maisie is stable. She's conscious." Yes, she's conscious. Something in Claire Sato's voice shifted, just fractionally, before the professional surface came back. "West like to speak with you, in person, if you're willing." "Tell her I'll come," Grant said. He hung up, looked at the cereal box for a moment, and then put it back in the cabinet. He wasn't hungry anymore anyway. Piper was at Mrs. Pacheco's next door. It was a Saturday, and Mrs. Pacheco had a standing invitation that Piper accepted approximately 4 times out of 5 because Mrs. Pacheco had a cat named Ferdinand and cable television, neither of which existed at Grant's house. He'd told Piper that morning that he had an errand, nothing more specific than that, and Piper had nodded in the way. No, she nodded when she already knew more than she was being given credit for. He changed into the same suit. It was still the best thing he owned. Mercy General was 40 minutes from Delwood Avenue in Saturday morning traffic. Grant drove without the radio on, which was his habit when he needed to think, though he wasn't sure what exactly he needed to think about. He'd agreed to come. He'd come. There wasn't much to arrange in his mind beyond that. What he was less prepared for was the parking structure, which was full on the 3rd and 4th levels. So he ended up on the roof with a broken ticket machine. He stood in the cold wind for 2 minutes trying to get the machine to register his card before giving up and writing the time on a gas station receipt he found in his pocket, which he planned to show at the exit booth and hope for the best. He found the right floor through 3 wrong turns and 1 elevator that opened on a maintenance corridor. 418 had a uniformed security man outside the door, which did not surprise Grant at all. What surprised him slightly was that the security man recognized him or had been told to recognize him, which amounted to the same thing, and opened the door without asking for anything. Grant stepped inside. The room was large by hospital standards, the kind that costs more per night than most people want to think about, but it had been made to look, with a certain amount of effort, like something other than a place you came to when your body failed you. There were real flowers on the windowsill, white peonies, actually, which struck Grant as a strange coincidence before he realized they were probably from whoever handled the Westlake family's logistics and had simply ordered what they always ordered. He'd intervened. There was a chair that looked comfortable next to the bed, and a second chair that looked functional near the window, and a small couch along the far wall. Maisie was in the bed. She was the first thing he saw. She was awake, which was what mattered, and the color had come back to her face, not all the way, not the full warmth that a healthy child carries, but enough. She had a monitor attached to her chest and an IV in her left arm, and the butterfly clip was gone from her hair, which was loose now and slightly tangled. She looked smaller than she had in the ballroom. Most people did, in hospital beds, but her eyes were alert, and they found him the moment he came through the door. "Hi," she said. "Hey," said Grant. Audrey was standing by the window, with her arms crossed and her back partially turned, the way people stand when they've been waiting for something and don't want to look like they've been waiting. She was not wearing last night's gown. She had on dark slacks and a gray sweater, no jewelry, her hair down, and she looked. Grant took this in without making anything of it. Exhausted. Sad, no, softened, just exhausted. In the specific way of someone who has been awake for a long time running on the particular fuel of pure anxiety, and whose body has started sending notices that the fuel gauge is low. She turned when he came in, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "You came," she said finally. It came out, without any of the inflection she'd intended, which meant it just sounded like an observation, which was probably the most honest version of it. "You asked," he said. That was apparently not the response she'd been prepared for. Her arms shifted slightly across her chest. "Sit down if you want." He didn't sit. Not yet. He looked at Maisie. "How are you feeling?" he asked her. Maisie considered this with the seriousness that the question deserved. tired, she said. My chest feels like someone sat on it. But the nurse said that's normal, so. She paused. You were there when I was on the floor. I don't remember it, but the doctor said someone was there, and I think. She stopped. Were you the one talking to my mom? I was trying to, Grant said. Maisie looked at her mother. Something passed between them that Grant didn't try to read. Okay, Maisie said. She settled back against the pillows in the way children do when they've received information they need to process and have decided to do it privately. Audrey walked to the second chair, the functional one, near the window, and sat in it, which seemed to be her way of indicating that she was ready to have whatever conversation this was. Grant sat in the comfortable chair beside Maisie's bed. For a moment, the only sound was the monitor and the muffled noise of the hospital corridor outside the door. I owe you an apology, Audrey said. She said it the way people say things they know they need to say and have been rehearsing, and are still not entirely sure they're saying right. It came out flat, not because she didn't mean it, but because meaning something and finding the right shape for it are two different problems. You don't owe me anything, Grant said. I had you removed from the room. Her jaw tightened. In front of hundreds of people. I didn't listen to you, and Maisie, she stopped. Her hands in her lap pressed together. You were right about what was happening. You were right, and I ignored it, because she stopped again. Because I looked like someone you could ignore, Grant said. He said it without heat, without bitterness, just as a fact being named. The accuracy of it hit her visibly, a small tightening around her eyes. Yes, she said. The word cost her something. He could see that it did, and he didn't enjoy it, because Grant Holloway was not a man who enjoyed watching people pay for things, even people who had publicly humiliated him the night before. She's okay, he said. That's what matters. It's not all that matters. Audrey's voice had something in it, now an edge, but not toward him, toward herself. What you knew. What you saw that I didn't see, that the doctors in that room didn't catch as fast as you did. Who are you? Because I had my assistant run your name this morning, and what she found was. She seemed to catch herself. I'm sorry. I had no right to do that. It's fine, Grant said. It isn't, Ms. Westlake. He looked at her directly. Your daughter almost died last night. You can run whatever name you want. Maisie, who had been doing a very convincing impression of someone drowsing, said quietly, she worries a lot. Audrey's tone held a warning, but a gentle one. It's true. Maisie's eyes stayed closed. Grant looked at the girl for a moment, then back at Audrey. What did your assistant find? He asked. Audrey looked at him carefully. Enough to explain last night. No, he agreed. A silence. Audrey was the kind of woman who was comfortable with silence. In negotiations, she'd learned to use it as a tool, to let it sit there and force the other side to fill it first. But this was not a negotiation. And she was more tired than she'd been in any negotiation she could remember. And after about 15 seconds, she said, Are you going to explain it? Grant leaned back in the chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. An old habit. Something he did when he was deciding how much of a thing to say. This morning, he said. This morning, I just wanted to see that she was okay. He stayed for 40 minutes. It was not what he'd expected when he walked in, but Maisie had a way of restructuring a room's intentions without appearing to try. She asked him about Piper. She'd heard Grant say his daughter's name during the chaos the night before, had apparently filed it away despite everything, and when Grant showed her the lock screen photo, the cotton candy picture from the state fair, Maisie looked at it for a long moment. It's nice, Maisie said. She is, said Grant. She's also an absolute pain in the neck when she doesn't get enough sleep, but we don't advertise that. Maisie smiled. It was a small smile, tired around the edges, but real. Audrey watched her daughter smile and didn't say anything. They talked about the choir performance, which Maisie had been too unwell to watch before she collapsed, and Grant to describe the matching bow ties on the boys, the slightly uneven rows, the conductor's baton that one of the younger kids kept staring at, like it might do something unexpected. He didn't perform the story or inflate it. He just told it the way it had been, which was ordinary and small, since somehow, in a hospital room at 9:30 on a Saturday morning, exactly the right scale. When he stood to go, Maisie reached out and touched his arm. Dramatically. Just a light pressure, the way children touch things they want to make real. Thank you for coming back in, she said. Grant looked at her small hand on his sleeve. Get some rest, he said. And do what the doctors tell you. Even the annoying parts. They're all annoying parts, Maisie said. He said, pretty much. He looked at Audrey on his way to the door. She had stood again, back near the window, and was watching him with an expression he didn't try to categorize. Mr. Holloway. She stopped him without raising her voice. He turned. She started over. I'd like to know, when you're ready to tell it. Whatever it is. She paused. I think I need to understand who I threw out of that room. Grant thought about that for a moment. He thought about what it meant to tell that story, about the weight of it, about the version of himself it described, and the distance between that version and the man standing in a hospital room in his best suit on a Saturday morning. I'll think about it, he said. It was not a yes. She heard that clearly, but it was also, and they both understood this, not a no. He left. The drive back was quieter than the drive there, which he hadn't thought was possible. Grant took the long way without meaning to miss to turn somewhere around the medical district and ended up on Halliday Boulevard, which ran along the river for about 2 miles before curving back toward the neighborhoods. He didn't correct it. He drove along the river road with the windows cracked despite the cold, and the water was low and gray and unremarkable, the way rivers are in late autumn when the light has gone flat and the trees along the bank have given up everything they're going to give. He thought about Audrey Westlake's face when Maisie had touched his arm. He thought about the way she'd said, I'd like to know, not I deserve to know, which was what most people in her position would have said and might have believed. There was something honest in that, he thought. The distinction between wanting and deserving. A lot of people never learned the difference. He wasn't sure what she'd do with the story when she had it. He wasn't sure he cared, exactly, but he wasn't sure he didn't either. And that uncertainty was interesting to him in the way that unexpected things sometimes were. He had spent 6 years building a life around certainty, around Piper's schedule and his work schedule and Mrs. Pacheco's standing invitation and the cereal in the cabinet and the note in the lunchbox every morning. Certainty was what had replaced everything else, all the things he'd put down when he came home and decided he was done being the person who ran toward things. Except that he'd run toward something last night. He had not made the decision consciously. Was the part that was hardest to account for. He'd made the decision on the sidewalk without deliberating, the same way he'd crossed the ballroom floor, the same way he'd knelt beside Maisie on the marble, not because he was a heroic, not because he was good, because there was a child who needed help and his body already knew how to help, and the knowledge didn't care that he'd decided to be someone else. He pulled onto Delwood Avenue at 10:43. Piper was sitting on the front steps of his house, even though she was supposed to be at Mrs. Pacheco's, which meant she had watched for his car, which meant she'd been thinking about last night more than she'd shown. He parked and got out, and she stood up from the steps and walked over, and he noticed she was wearing his old sweatshirt, the gray one from the Navy, faded and large on her. The sleeves rolled up 4 times because she wore it sometimes when she was uncertain about something and didn't want to say so. No. How's the girl? Piper asked. Doing better. Piper nodded. She fell into step beside him as he walked up to the door. Mrs. Pacheco made pan dulce. She sent some for you. It's on the counter. Tell her thank you. I already did. Piper held the door open for him in an elaborate show of helpfulness that meant she was about to ask something. Yeah. Why did those men take you out of the room? Grant unlocked the inner door, because I was trying to get to the girl, and her mother didn't know who I was. Piper processed this, but you were trying to help. That, he held the door for her. She didn't. They went inside. The house smelled like the pan dulce on the counter, and the faint dog who sometimes came in when the back door was left open. They didn't have a dog. Smell of someone else's was one of those specific domestic mysteries that Grant had stopped trying to solve. He set his keys on the hook by the door. He loosened his tie. Did she apologize? Piper asked. He looked at his daughter. He said, she did. Piper appeared to weigh this. She pulled the sleeves of the sweatshirt down over her hands and looked at the floor for a moment. Was it a good apology or a because I have to apology? Grant took off his jacket and hung it carefully on the back of the chair, because if it went on a hanger, it had a chance of lasting another season. He thought about Audrey Westlake sitting in the functional chair, with her hands pressed together, saying yes with the weight of someone who had not expected to have to say it. It was real, he said. Piper looked up. Something in her expression settled. "Kay," she said. "Good." She climbed up onto the kitchen counter, where she always sat when she was going to tell him something, a habit she'd had since she was 4 years old and wanted to be at eye level with the adults. She folded her legs and looked at him. "She should be careful, though," Piper said. Grant opened a cabinet and looked for something to eat that wasn't cereal and didn't require cooking. "Why's that?" "Because," Piper said, with the terrible clarity of children who observe more than they're given credit for, "you're not always going to be there." Grant found a can of soup in the back of the cabinet. He turned it over in his hands and looked at it without reading the label. He said, "I'm not." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, a car passed on Delwood Avenue, and then another, and then the street settled back into its Saturday self-ordinary, and slow and no particular thing happening. "Is she nice?" Piper asked. "The girl Maisie." "I think so," Grant said. "She's got a good head on her." "Is her mom nice?" He thought about this honestly. "She's complicated," he said. "She's trying." Piper accepted this with a nod that was more adult than she probably knew. "That's what Mrs. Pacheco says about people she doesn't want to call bad, but isn't sure are good yet. Mrs. Pacheco is a smart woman." "I know," said Piper. "She said that too." 3 days later, Audrey Westlake came to Delwood Avenue. Assistant, no driver. Or rather, there was a car that waited at the curb, but she walked up the front path, alone, which Grant saw through the kitchen window, and which told him something, though he wasn't entirely sure what. She was in a coat he recognized as expensive even from a distance, dark and well-fitted, but her hair was in a simple ponytail, and she was carrying nothing except her phone in her coat pocket. He met her at the door before she could knock because he'd seen her coming. She looked at him. He looked at her. The cold air sat between them. "I should have called," she said. "You probably should have," he agreed. He opened the door wider. "Come in." She stepped into the front hall and stopped when they enter a house that is not what they expected and are trying to readjust. Judgmentally, or if there was judgment, she was keeping it private. The house was small and clean and full of Piper, drawings on the refrigerator, a single sneaker in the middle of the hallway, 3 library books stacked on the coffee table, with a juice cup ring on the top one. There was a spider plant on the windowsill that had been alive for 3 years, through what Grant privately considered to be an act of sheer stubbornness on the plant's part, because he was not an attentive plant owner. "She's at school," Grant said, meaning Piper, because Audrey was looking at the sneaker. "I didn't want to." Audrey stopped. Started over, in the way he was beginning to recognize as characteristic of her the first draft abandoned, the second draft more honest. "I wanted to talk to you without an audience." "Okay," he said. "You want coffee?" She looked mildly surprised by the question. Sure, the kitchen was small enough that making coffee required some navigation, and Audrey sat in one of the 2 chairs at the table while Grant did it, and the domestic smallness of the scene was something neither of them commented on. He set the mug in front of her and sat with his own, and she wrapped both hands around hers and looked at him across the table, with the particular directness of a woman who had decided at some point during the drive over to stop managing the conversation before it started. "Tell me," she said. He drank his coffee. Then Grant Holloway told her about the years she hadn't found in any search. He told it plainly, the way he told the very few people he'd told it to, without drama, without the kind of framing that turns a life into a story with a message. He told her about enlisting at 20, about the training, about what the training did to the way your mind worked, and whether that changed back when you stopped needing it to. He told her about the things he'd seen, and the things he'd done, not in detail, not in the way that would make her feel the weight of it, but enough that she understood what the foundation of the evening at the Sterling Crown had been built on. He told her about coming home and wanting nothing but ordinary, about meeting Carla at a barbecue in August, about the way she laughed at everything he said, as though she genuinely couldn't help it. Piper being born, and being the most alarming thing that had ever happened to him, including certain things that had happened overseas, because nothing in his training had prepared him for a 7-pound person who needed him for every single thing and showed it by screaming. And then he told her about losing Carla not slowly, not with warning, not with the kind of time that allows for goodbyes. An aneurysm 3 years ago, on a Wednesday afternoon, while Piper was at kindergarten. Grant had been at work. He'd gotten the call at 2:15. By 2:45, nothing was what it had been 24 hours before, and nothing would be again. He told this part the way he told all of it flatly, without ornament, with the specific internal stillness of a man who has processed something as completely as it's possible to process it, and found that what remains is not peace, exactly, but a kind of settled weight that you learn to carry without letting it pull you sideways. Audrey did not say she was sorry. He was grateful for that. He'd heard it enough that it had become meaningless, and from her, in this kitchen, it would have felt like the wrong currency. So what she said after a silence that lasted long enough to be real was, "You buried all of it." "I tried to," he said. "Turns out some of it is just in there. Permanently." She looked at him. "Like what happened at the gala." "Yeah." She turned her mug in a slow circle on the table. "I watched you, you know. In the ballroom after you came back in. Was on the floor next to Maisie and I could see you talking to Renata Doctor. Osi and I kept waiting for you to look like what you looked like when I thought you were just some—" She stopped. "But you didn't. What did I look like?" She was quiet for a moment. "Like the room was a problem you already knew how to solve," she said. Grant considered this. It wasn't wrong. "Exactly. I didn't know how to solve it," he said. "I knew how to make it smaller. How to break it down until the pieces were manageable." "That's different. Is it?" "Yeah. Solving it would have meant Maisie didn't need the hospital." He looked at his coffee. Making it smaller meant she got there. Audrey sat with that. The kitchen was quiet. Through the window over the sink, the backyard was visible, small, fenced, a plastic slide that Piper had outgrown, but neither of them had gotten around to removing. "What do you want?" Audrey asked, finally. Not the way she'd asked at the hospital, businesslike, preparing to make an offer. Differently. From what? From any of this. "I had Claire prepare something. Compensation for what happened and for the role you played in," Grant said. Not unkindly, but immediately. Audrey had been prepared for this. "Public acknowledgement, then. Your name—" "No." She looked at him. "You're going to make this difficult." "I'm not making it anything," he said. "I don't want your money. I don't want my name anywhere. I went back in because there was a kid on the floor." He set his mug down. "That's it. That's the whole story." "That's not the whole story." She said it quietly, and he recognized she was right about that, which he didn't offer out loud. He was silent for a moment. Then, "There's something you could do. For me." She waited. "Single parents," he said. "The ones who don't have what you have. Emergency coverage when a kid gets sick and you can't miss work or you lose the job. Child care that doesn't cost more than the paycheck it's supposed to free up." He looked at her directly. "You raise a lot of money, Ms. Westlake. Not all of it has to go to things that look good in a press release." Audrey was quiet for a long time. Long enough that he couldn't read it. "What you want," she said. "That's what would matter," he said. She looked at the table. She looked at the refrigerator with Piper's drawings on it. She looked at the sneaker in the hall, still where Piper had left it, because Grant had made a policy some years back not picking up things that Piper was entirely capable of picking up herself. A policy that resulted in a good deal of scattered footwear, but also in a kid who understood cause and effect. "Okay," Audrey said. "Just that. No negotiation, no caveats." Grant picked up his mug. Outside, the sky had gone white with the particular blankness of a sky, deciding whether to do something, and the backyard was very still, and the plastic slide stood in the corner of the fence looking exactly as abandoned as it was. "Your coffee's getting cold," he said. Audrey looked at her mug as though she'd forgotten it was there. She drank it anyway, cold and all, which he hadn't expected, and which told him something about her, that the gown and the composure and the 400 guests had not. They sat in the kitchen on Delwood Avenue for another half hour, and they talked about less consequential things: Maisie's upcoming appointment, the hospital's cardiac team, the possibility that the third procedure would be moved to February. They talked about Piper's choir, and whether Danny Boy was too sad a song for an 8-year-old's voice, which was Grant's opinion, though he hadn't said it before. When Audrey left, she walked back down the path to the waiting car, and Grant stood in the doorway and watched her go. And the cold came in through the open door, and he let it for a moment before he closed it. He picked up Piper's sneaker off the hallway floor. He set it by the door where it belonged. Then he went back to the kitchen and washed the 2 mugs, and the water was warm, and the morning went on. The word got out the way words always get out in rooms full of people who have smartphones and something to talk about. By Sunday morning, 2 days after the gala, there were photographs circulating of Maisie, because the security team had managed that effectively, of Grant. 3 separate phone cameras had caught some fragment of the scene at the marble doors, and the clearest one showed him mid-turn, looking back into the ballroom, his face in 3/4 profile, the 2 security men on either side of him. Someone had added a caption. It had been shared 4,000 times before noon. Grant didn't see any of this, because Grant was not on social media, had never been on social media, and considered this one of the better decisions of his adult life. He found out about it from his coworker Dennis on Monday morning, when Dennis came into the break room at the hardware supply warehouse, holding his phone out like it was evidence. "That's you," Dennis said. Grant looked at the photograph. "You're famous. I'm really not. 4,000 shares, man. 4,000. That's viral." "Dennis," Grant poured his coffee. "I need you to not make this a thing." Dennis lowered the phone. He was 26, enthusiastic in the way of people who have not yet had enthusiasm cost them anything significant, and he looked at Grant with the specific bafflement of someone who cannot understand why a person would not want 4,000 people to know their name. "You saved a kid." "A lot of people helped that kid," Grant said. "The paramedics, her doctors. He stopped. He'd been about to say I was just there, which wasn't entirely true, but was close enough to truth that saying it felt manageable. "I was just one part of it." Dennis stared at him. "You're the most boring, famous person I've ever seen." "Good," Grant said, and took his coffee to his desk. The thing was, and this was the part he hadn't told Dennis, hadn't told anyone except Audrey Westlake in her kitchen. On Saturday morning, the attention made him feel something specific and unpleasant that he recognized from a long time ago. Not fear, exactly. Something adjacent to it. The feeling of being watched closely by people who didn't know what they were looking at and were going to assign a meaning regardless. He'd lived inside other people's meanings before. He was not interested in doing it again. What he hadn't anticipated was the foundation. He'd said what he'd said to Audrey, at the kitchen table, single parents, emergency coverage, childcare, and she'd said, okay, and he'd believed her, the way you believe something when the person saying it has nothing left to gain from lying. He'd also half expected the friction of implementation. The meetings, the committees, the way large money moves slowly and with great deliberation through layers of approval, the way institutions protect themselves from their own best intentions. He had not expected Audrey Westlake to call him 3 weeks later and say, "We're restructuring the foundation. Want you to be involved." He'd been eating dinner Piper's spaghetti, which she made on Thursdays because it was the one thing she'd learned to cook that didn't result in the smoke alarm, and which involved a jar of sauce and a level of pride that the jar of sauce didn't entirely justify, but which Grant had never once pointed out. He looked at Piper across the table. She was watching him with a piece of spaghetti halfway to her mouth. "I don't know anything about running a foundation," he said into the phone. "I'm not asking you to run it," Audrey said. She had the voice of someone who had spent 20 minutes deciding how to say this before picking up the phone. "I want you to advise on the new programming. You know what these families actually need because you've lived it. My team knows how to build programs. Neither of us knows what the other knows." That's a strange way to put it. It's accurate. He watched Piper set her fork down and fold her hands on the table in an elaborate impression of someone who was absolutely not listening. "I have a job," he said. "I know. It's daytime work. Evenings," Audrey said. "Video calls mostly. One in-person meeting a month, maybe. You'd be compensated for your time before you say no to that. Hear me out. This isn't charity. It's a consulting arrangement. You have specific knowledge I'm paying for. That's a transaction." Grant rubbed the back of his neck. Piper was still sitting with her hands folded, still not listening with every cell in her body. "Let me think about it," he said. "Of course," Audrey said. "Maisie wanted me to ask if Piper likes horses." He looked at the phone. "What?" "She's been learning to ride at a stable outside the city. She wanted, I don't know. She's 9. She wanted to know if your daughter would want to come sometime." Piper had apparently given up on the pretense of not listening because she was now looking at him with both eyebrows. raised in an expression of extremely focused hope. "I'll think about that too," Grant said. He hung up. Piper waited approximately 1 second before saying, "Horses." He said, "Dad, eat your spaghetti." She ate her spaghetti with the focused energy of a child who has decided to be very agreeable in this specific moment so that the person across from her understands what an agreeable, horse-deserving person she is. He said yes to the consulting. He said yes to the horses, which was a separate and more complicated decision because it involved Piper in a way the consulting didn't. And Grant was careful with things that involved Piper, was careful about who entered her orbit, about what she observed, about the lessons she was learning from watching him navigate the world, not because he was overprotective, but because he understood, in the specific way of a person who lost someone without warning, that the people around you become part of you in ways you don't always choose. He drove Piper out to Ridgecrest Stables on a Saturday morning in November, 3 weeks after the call. The stable was 40 minutes from Delwood Avenue and significantly outside the kind of neighborhood Grant normally drove through. The properties out here sat on land that measured itself in acres, and the fences were the kind that announced money without being crass about it. He parked in the gravel lot and sat for a moment. "You okay?" Piper asked. "Fine," he said, "just thinking." "You think a lot before you do things. That's usually a good habit." Piper looked at the stable. "Are they fancy, Maisie?" He considered. Maisie's just a kid. Her mom, he got out of the car. Her mom is working on it. Audrey was already there when they arrived, standing outside the main stable entrance in riding boots and a waxed canvas jacket that still managed to look like something that cost real money, which was probably just an inevitability at this point, Grant thought. Maisie was beside her in a riding helmet that was slightly too big, listing to one side, which she hadn't noticed yet. So Piper got out of the car and stopped. Maisie looked at her. Then Maisie's face broke into the wide, uncomplicated grin of a child who has been waiting for something and is surprised to discover the something is better than expected. And she walked over to Piper with her helmet listing and said, "Do you like horses, or are you scared of them? Because it's okay if you're scared, the ones here are pretty calm. But I wanted to know ahead of time." Piper looked at her. "I've never been near one before." "That's fine. I was scared the first time. I cried a little, but I'm not telling anyone that." Maisie paused. "Now I told you. But you seem okay." Piper smiled. "It was the real one, not the careful public version." "I seem okay?" "Yeah, you have a calm face." Maisie adjusted her helmet, which immediately listed the other direction. "My mom says I can read people, but I think mostly I just say things out loud that other people are thinking." "That's actually a useful skill," Piper said. "That's what I said Maisie. They walked into the stable together, Maisie already talking about the horse she'd been assigned a gray named Ptolemy, who had, according to Maisie, an attitude problem and extremely good hair. And Piper listening with the whole body attention she gave to things that genuinely interested her. Grant watched them go. Audrey came to stand beside him. "Her helmet fits badly," he said. "She refuses to wear a different one. She says that one is lucky. Has she fallen off with it yet? Twice, then she's wrong about the luck." "I know," Audrey said. "Decided to let that one go." They were quiet for a moment, in the way that people are quiet when they are getting used to the particular frequency of each other, the specific sound of someone else's silence. "You agreed to the consulting," Audrey said. "I did." Why? She said it without weight, just genuine curiosity, the kind that doesn't need an answer to be complete. He thought about it honestly. "Because you meant it," he said, "when you said it." And because he stopped. "It matters. What you do with the money matters. I wanted to be in the room where that gets decided." She glanced at him. "You trust that I'll use it right?" "I trust that you'll tell me when you're not," he said, "and that you'll listen when I tell you." Something shifted in her expression, not softening. Exactly. Because Audrey Westlake didn't soften in any conventional sense, but something that was adjacent to relief, like a tension releasing that she hadn't named before now. "I can do that," she said. The consulting work was stranger than Grant had expected, and more involving. The first video call was a Tuesday evening after Piper was in bed, and Audrey had assembled a team of 3 from the foundation, her program director, a woman named Sylvie Park, who wore reading glass at tests and spoke with the quiet precision of someone who had built many things and watched half of them fail and learned more from the failures, a financial analyst named Rob Ing, who had a habit of finishing other people's numbers before they finished saying them, not rudely but reflexively, like a tick, and a consultant the foundation used for program assessment, a man named Marcus Torres, who reminded Grant faintly of certain officers he'd known, in the specific way of people who are very comfortable being the smartest person in the room. They were all good at their jobs. They were all good at their jobs. They were all operating at a considerable remove from the lives they were designing programs to help. Grant understood this was not malice. It was distance. The particular distance that accumulates when you have never had to figure out which bill to skip this month. No, when you have never called in sick to work because you couldn't find child care and lost the job anyway. When you have never sat in a parking lot outside a pharmacy doing the arithmetic of what you could afford versus what your kid actually needed. He said some of this in the first call, not combatively, just as information they didn't have. The room was quiet when he finished. Not the quiet of offense, but the quiet of recalibration. Sylvie Park took her reading glasses off. "Give us a specific example," she said. So he did. He told them about the month after Carla died, when Piper was 5 and he'd gone back to work 14 days later, because there was no other option and the bereavement leave had already run out. He told them about the morning Piper woke up sick, not seriously sick, just a fever of 101, the ordinary sick of a kindergartner, and the chain of calls he'd made before 7 a.m. trying to find someone who could take her for the day. He told them about how the backup fell through at the last minute and how he'd had to call his shift manager. And how the shift manager had been decent about it that day and less decent about it 6 weeks later when it happened again. He told them what it cost. Not in dollars. In the other kind. Nobody interrupted. When he stopped, Marcus Torres said, "How long did you operate like that before things stabilized?" 2 years, Grant said. And stabilized is generous. It's more like, he thought about the right word. You reach a point where the crisis becomes routine. You're still managing the same problems, you just stop expecting them to go away. Rob Ing had stopped finishing other people's numbers. He was just listening. Audrey, who had been quiet through most of the call, said, "What would have changed it? Early on. Specific thing would have made the difference." No, Grant didn't have to think long about that one. Knowing someone would pick her up if I couldn't. A favor I had to beg for. Not charity, just a number I could call. He paused. That using it wouldn't cost me the job. Sylvie Park wrote something. 3 weeks later, she sent Grant a draft of a program framework that included emergency childcare dispatch, employer partnership agreements, and a confidential case management line. He read it at the kitchen table, with his coffee going cold, and read it again. And there were things in it that were wrong things that looked right on paper and would not work the way real people lived. And he made notes in the margins. In the specific shorthand of someone who marks up documents the way other people talk, and sent it back. She sent a revised draft a week after that. They went back and forth 4 times. The 5th draft was something he could endorse without qualification. He told her so. She wrote back, "Good, that's what we were aiming for." Zitzed him. It was the most satisfying exchange he'd had about anything in several years, which said something about the previous several years that he wasn't going to examine too closely. He did not think about what any of this meant in the large sense. He was not a man who spent much time in the large sense. He thought about the next call, and whether the program framework would survive contact with actual implementation, and whether Piper was going to need new boots before winter, because the current ones were definitely half a size too small. And she hadn't said anything because she didn't complain about things like that, which was admirable and also occasionally inconvenient. What he noticed without making much of it was that Piper had started talking about Maisie the way she talked about things she'd decided were permanent, as a recent event but as a fact of life. Maisie says this. Maisie's afraid of that. Maisie did the thing with the horse again. The thing with the horse had occurred on their 3rd visit to Ridgecrest, when Ptolemy the Grey with the attitude had pulled away from Maisie's grip on the lead and trotted freely to the other end of the paddock, and Maisie had stood watching him with her hands on her hips and said, loudly and with great dignity, "Fine, I don't need you either," which had made the stable instructor laugh hard enough to lean against the fence, and which had made Piper laugh, and which had made Grant, from his position outside the paddock fence, produce a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same family. Audrey had watched this from beside him and said nothing for a long moment. She'd said, "She gets that from me." The stubbornness? The pride. She'd paused. They're not always different things. He'd looked at her. She was still watching Maisie, who was now negotiating with Ptolemy across the paddock, with the patient intensity of someone who had decided they were going to win this, eventually, and was content to wait. He'd said, "They're not." November moved into December the way it does not dramatically, just a slow draining of color from the world and a lengthening of dark and the appearance, in storefronts and on houses, of lights that made the dark easier to stand. Grant put lights on the front porch because Piper asked him to, and because the previous year he'd put them up crookedly, and she'd never fully forgiven him, so this year he was determined to get them right. No, he got them right on the second try, which he counted as a reasonable success rate. The Foundation's new programming, what Audrey's communications team was calling the Family Forward Initiative, a name that Grant found slightly too polished, but kept his opinion on to himself, was announced publicly in early December. There was a press conference that Grant was explicitly not attending, which he had made clear and which Audrey had accepted without argument. There was, however, a brief paragraph in the Foundation's official statement that mentioned a community advisor who provided essential guidance from lived experience with no name attached. Grant had approved that language. He'd had Sylvie Park send it to him first, and read it 3 times and confirmed that it said what it needed to say without being about him. He read the coverage online from his phone, standing in the parking lot of the grocery store, because he'd finally remembered to buy milk. The reactions were largely what he expected: positive, skeptical in some quarters, enthusiastic in others. One editorial called it a significant shift in how the Foundation prioritized its giving, called it a PR maneuver. A third didn't mention it at all, and focused on the auction results from the restructured December Recoques Gala, which had raised more than the November event, despite or possibly because of the article carefully suggested the events of that evening. Grant bought the milk and drove home. 3 weeks before the December Gala, Maisie had her 3rd cardiac procedure. Grant found out, because Piper found out. Maisie had told her at the stable, matter-of-factly, in the way that children who have grown up inside medical conversations discuss them. "I have to have surgery in December. It's the one they've been planning. I'm not scared." Then a pause. "I'm a little scared." Piper had reported this to Grant that evening with the careful precision of someone relaying important information. And she'd looked at him and said, "Should we do something?" "Like what?" he'd asked. Piper had thought about it. "What do people do?" "They show up," he'd said. "When they can." Piper had nodded slowly. "Can we?" He'd considered his schedule, his shift, Mrs. Pacheco's availability, the distance to Mercy General, and everything else that went into the logistics of being a single parent whose life ran on a narrow margin of flexibility. "Yeah," he'd said. "We can." On the morning of the procedure, Grant dropped Piper at school. He'd rearranged his afternoon with his shift manager, who had become marginally more flexible since Grant had worked a coverage shift that saved the manager a significant staffing problem 3 months ago, had filed this debt in whatever internal ledger managers kept, and drove to Mercy General. He brought coffee, 2 cups, from the place on 5th that Audrey had mentioned once in Sat, which he'd written down and remembered because that was the kind of thing he did, noted small information against the possibility it might be useful. He found her in the surgical waiting room on the 3rd floor. She was alone. There was a tablet open on the seat beside her, with documents on the screen that she wasn't reading, and a paper cup of bad coffee from the floor's vending area going cold in her hand, and she was sitting in the particular way of people in waiting rooms who have decided the thing to do is not move, as though a stillness might somehow help. She looked up footsteps, and her face did something very brief before settling back into its customary arrangement. Grant sat down 2 seats away. He set one of the cups on the seat between them. "You didn't have to come," she said. "Piper asked me to show up," he said. "When she can't." Audrey looked at the cup between them. She picked it up. She looked at the logo on the side, and then at him, and something in her expression shifted in the way it did when something reached further than expected. She asked. "You mentioned it," he said. She looked away. Her jaw moved slightly. The way jaws move when the thing happening inside a person is too complicated, and the face is trying to keep up. Outside the waiting room windows, the city went about its morning, the particular indifferent bustle of a city that does not adjust its pace for anyone's emergency. She was brave, Audrey said, before they took her in. She kept telling me she was fine. She probably was fine, Grant said. She was scared. Both things can be true. Audrey held the coffee cup in both hands and didn't say anything for a while, and Grant didn't try to fill it. After a few minutes, she said, "I'm not good at this part. Waiting, not being useful." She said it with a precision that told him she'd identified this in herself at some point, probably long ago, and had not reconciled with it. It's nothing to do. No decision to make. No problem I can solve. Just sitting here. Yeah, he said. How do you stand it? He looked at the waiting room floor, the particular institutional tile that every hospital in the world seemed to have in common. I think about what it was like before I had anything to wait for, he said. Makes the waiting easier. Audrey was quiet for a moment. That's either wise or depressing. Usually both, he said. She laughed. It was short and came out surprised. The way laughs do when they've been sitting inside someone who has been too tense to release them. And it was nothing like the polished, social laughter he'd seen at the gala. It was just a real sound, out of a real person, in a waiting room with bad tile and good coffee. They sat together for 2 hours and 40 minutes. They talked some about the foundation, about a complication in the employer partnership rollout that Sylvie had flagged, whether Ptolemy had genuinely gotten more cooperative since Maisie started bringing him apples, or whether he was just strategically tolerant. They were quiet a lot, the comfortable kind that had taken time to develop and now felt unremarkable, which was its own kind of progress. When the surgeon came out, a compact, serious man named Dr. Vasquez, who did not carry his face in a way that told you anything before he was ready to tell you. Grant stood up the same time Audrey did. Dr. Vasquez glanced at Grant briefly, a professional assessment, and then at Audrey. She did great, he said. Everything went the way we planned. She's in recovery and she's already been asking for her phone, which I'm choosing to take as a positive sign. Audrey put both hands over her mouth, just for a second. Just long enough for the thing she'd been holding not to show to come out and be witnessed, and then her hands came down, and her face was mostly arranged again, though her eyes were bright in a way that she wasn't troubling herself to hide. "Thank you," she said to Dr. Vasquez, and her voice came out steady, which Grant suspected cost her something. Dr. Vasquez nodded and moved on to his next conversation. Because surgical waiting rooms did not run on anyone's particular emotional schedule, Audrey stood in the middle of the waiting room with her hands at her sides. Then she turned to Grant. She didn't say anything. She didn't appear to have words for whatever she was trying to say, and Grant, who had been in a fair number of situations where words were not the right tool, didn't try to supply them. He just stayed where he was, which was, it turned out, exactly the right distance. After a moment, Audrey straightened. She picked up her tablet from the seat and tucked it under her arm. "I need to go see her," she said. "Go," he said. She walked toward the recovery wing, and at the corridor entrance, she stopped and turned back. "Grant," she said. It was the first time she'd used his first name. He looked at her. "Thank you," she said, "for showing up." He picked up his coffee cup. "Tell her Piper says hi." Audrey nodded. She turned and walked down the corridor, and he watched her go, and then he found the elevator and pressed the button for the ground floor and stood in the small metal box as it descended. And when the doors opened, the lobby of Mercy General was full of its usual traffic. People arriving, people leaving, a woman with a sleeping baby in a carrier, a man in a heavy coat reading something on his phone, and Grant walked through the middle of it and out the automatic doors and into the cold. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed. The city was right there, exactly where he'd left it. He pulled out his phone and sent a text to Piper, who was in school but would read it at lunch. It said, "She's okay, surgery went well." Then he put his phone back in his pocket and walked to the parking structure and found his car on the 3rd level and drove back toward Delwood Avenue with the heater going and the radio still off. The tree air freshener was gone. He'd finally thrown it out last week when it fell into the cup holder, and he'd realized it had never once smelled like a tree. He'd replaced it with nothing, and the car smelled like itself now, old upholstery, and whatever Piper had last eaten in the back seat, which was, all things considered, more accurate. He drove. The city opened up ahead of him, gray and enormous and entirely unconcerned with the specific weight of his morning, and he moved through it the way he moved through most things, at a pace that was neither fast nor slow, watching what was in front of him, keeping both hands on the wheel. Maisie came home from Mercy General on a Thursday. She came home with a new scar, a list of restrictions that she had already begun negotiating against, and an opinion about hospital food that she delivered at length to anyone who would listen. The scar ran along her left side, neat and precise the way Dr. Vasquez did everything, and Maisie had looked at it in the mirror on the second morning and declared that it looked like a crescent moon, which Audrey had found simultaneously heartbreaking and characteristic of exactly who her daughter was. The restrictions were the harder part. No riding for 8 weeks. Physical activity. Rest, which was a concept Maisie treated as a personal insult delivered directly to her by the medical profession. By the end of the first week at home, she had reorganized her bookshelf by color, taught herself 3-card tricks from a library book, written what she described as a novel and what was actually 11 pages of a story about a girl who could talk to horses, specifically a gray horse, with an attitude problem named something very close to Ptolemy, and had asked Audrey, daily, when Piper was coming over. "She's not a medication," Audrey said on the 5th day. That, Maisie said from the couch, where she was technically resting and actually doing something complex with the deck of cards that didn't look restful at all. But she said she'd come when I got home, and I'm home. She's in school, not today. Today is Saturday. Audrey looked up from her laptop. It was, in fact, Saturday. She'd lost track, the way she did during weeks that ran on hospital rhythms and foundation obligations, and the specific stress of watching her daughter recover from something that required her, Audrey, to act calm, while feeling nothing of the sort. She called Grant. He answered on the second ring, which she'd noticed was his habit, not the first ring, never the first, but reliably the second, as though he gave every call one moment of consideration before committing. "She's asking for Piper," Audrey said. "I heard that," said Piper, from somewhere in the background. A pause. Then Grant, in the tone of a man making a small concession to an unstoppable force, "We can come this afternoon." "Have to,"
Wait!
Piper said, clearly now, much closer to the phone. Audrey looked at Maisie across the living room. Maisie had set down the cards and was watching her with the focused hopefulness of a child who is trying to influence events through eye contact alone. 2 o'clock, Audrey said. 2 o'clock, Grant agreed. They came at 2, or rather at 2:11, because Grant had stopped for gas, and the gas station on Meridian had one pump out of service, a detail he provided when Audrey opened the door, not as an apology but as information, which she was learning was how he generally communicated practical facts. Piper was through the door and across the living room before Grant had fully stepped inside, sitting cross-legged on the floor in front of Maisie's couch with the immediate ease of children who have decided that a friendship is established and don't require additional formality to confirm it. "No. Does it hurt?" Piper asked, with the directness of someone who has decided that the question Maisie actually wants asked is not the careful, soft-edged version. Maisie considered. Not like pain anymore. More like tight. Like someone put a rubber band around my ribs and forgot to take it off. Piper nodded seriously. "Can you see the scar?" "Yeah." Maisie lifted the edge of her shirt without ceremony, showing the edge of the incision. "I named it. You named your scar. It looks like a crescent moon, so I called it Luna." Piper looked at this with appropriate solemnity. "That's actually a good name." "I thought so too." Maisie pulled her shirt back down. "My mom said it was morbid. Your mom sounds like she worries a lot." "She does." Maisie glanced toward the kitchen, where Audrey had taken Grant on the pretense of making coffee, and where they could be heard, distantly, talking about something logistical. "She's better than she was, though. She used to never sit down." Piper looked in the direction of the kitchen, too, then back at Maisie. "My dad used to never talk," she said. "Like he'd talk normally, not about anything real. He's better, too." Maisie tilted her head. "Do you think that's because of us?" Piper thought about it. "I think it's more because of them," she said. "But we helped." Maisie smiled. It was the same smile Grant had seen in the hospital, tired around the edges, but real in the middle. Yeah, she said. Probably. In the kitchen, Grant was leaning against the counter while Audrey made coffee in a machine that looked like it had been designed by an aerospace engineer. With enough buttons and settings that he'd have needed a manual to operate it without embarrassing himself. She moved through it from memory, the small domestic competence of someone who does a thing the same way every day until it becomes automatic. She looks good, Grant said. He meant Maisie, and Audrey understood that. She looks better than she did. Audrey measured coffee with the precision she brought to most tasks. She looks like herself again, she stopped, started over. I forgot for a while in there what she looked like when she was just herself. Maisie, not a patient. That goes away fast, Grant said. When someone you love is sick. Audrey looked at him. Carla, he nodded once. She didn't press it. She'd learned over the past weeks the specific geography of what Grant would discuss and what he kept at a distance, not because he was hiding it, but because some things didn't require words to remain present. She'd come to recognize the way his expression shifted. When Carla came into the vicinity of a conversation not closed, not guarded, just inward, in a way that indicated he was carrying something and didn't need help carrying it, only acknowledgement that he was. The foundation announcement, she said, moving to the more practical ground they both navigated better. The coverage in the Tribune was... I saw it. The op-ed wasn't fair. The op-ed wasn't wrong either, he said. Not entirely. No. He looked at the coffee machine, where something was happening with steam. You're a billionaire starting a program for people who need emergency childcare. The skepticism is legitimate. The question is whether the program actually works. And if it doesn't, then you fix it. He said it, simply the way he said most things. That's all. You don't get credit for trying. You get credit for making it work. Audrey poured the coffee. She handed him his mug she'd remembered without being told that he took it black, which was a small thing, and not a small thing simultaneously. You're harder on me than anyone on my board, she said. Your board wants to keep their positions, he said. And you want what? He looked at her over his mug. The program to work. She studied him for a moment, in the way she studied things she was still trying to understand. She said most people in your position, after what happened at the gala, would have taken the money, or the recognition, or at minimum, satisfaction of watching me be publicly embarrassed. People, he said. You didn't want any of it. I wanted Maisie to be okay, he said. Everything else was other people's business. Audrey was quiet, turning her mug in a slow circle on the counter. Outside the kitchen window, the December sky was doing what December skies did, sitting heavy and white and non-committal, threatening weather without delivering it. I've been thinking, she said, about the gala. The original one? The December one. She looked up. We're doing it differently this year. Smaller. More focused. The steering committee wanted to keep it as a major event, and I overruled them, she made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. I'm told I do that more than is professionally advisable. Do you think you're wrong when you do it? Sometimes. Were you wrong this time? She considered honestly. Then it's fine. He drank his coffee. What did you change? Fewer guests, auction. Just a dinner and a presentation about where the money goes, specifically where it goes, not the vague feel-good version. And I want to acknowledge, she stopped, reorganized. I want to acknowledge publicly what happened in November, not to relitigate it. Just there are things I did that night that need to be said out loud in that room, in front of the people who were there. Grant set his mug down. He was quiet for a moment in the specific way he was quiet when he was considering something with actual care. You don't have to do that, he said. I know. It'll make some people uncomfortable. It'll make the press, too. Her voice was even. I'm doing it anyway, he looked at her. The Audrey Westlake, who had pointed at the marble doors and said, get him out, had not been a different person. She was still in there. Sat that certainty, that reflexive command. But something around it had changed in the past several weeks, the way landscapes change after a significant weather event. Not destroyed, but rearranged, different in its details, though recognizable in its essential shape. Are you going to name me? He asked. She said it immediately. If you don't want. I'll describe what happened without specifics. People who were there will understand. People who weren't, she shrugged. It doesn't matter what they understand. He picked up his mug again. Okay, he said. Okay, you'll come? Or okay, you don't object, he said. The December Gala was held on the 14th at the Sterling Crown, in a ballroom that was the same room and completely different. The same chandeliers, the same Italian marble, the same gilded plasterwork that nobody looked at. But the tables were fewer and set closer together. The flowers were simpler, and the evening had been restructured from a performance of wealth into something that felt, by the halfway point, more like a meeting of people who had decided to be honest with each other about what they were doing and why. Grant came with Piper. He wore the navy suit because it was still the best thing he owned, and because he'd made a quiet, private decision that he was not going to go buy something new to make anyone else comfortable, including himself. Piper wore a green dress that she'd chosen herself and a pair of shoes that she'd also chosen herself, and that were, in Grant's assessment, going to hurt by the end of the night, which he had mentioned once, and she had dismissed with the confidence of someone who knows they're making a bad decision, and intends to make it fully. The security man at the front doors was not the same one from November, but the doors were the same, and the marble was the same. And Grant walked through them at 7:15 and on a Tuesday evening in December, with Piper beside him and the cold at his back, and nobody stopped them. Audrey and Maisie were near the entrance. Maisie was in a blue dress that matched her eyes and was wearing the butterfly clip, restored to its position in her hair, and she was standing with her posture carefully managed in the way of someone who has been told by medical professionals that she can attend a short event provided she doesn't overdo it, and who has decided that the definition of overdo it is flexible. When she saw Piper, her posture management immediately deteriorated in the best possible way. "You came," Maisie said to Piper. "Obviously," said Piper, as though any other outcome was inconceivable. They moved off together toward the table assignments, Maisie already explaining something about the evening's program that she'd apparently been briefed on. Piper listening with her whole face. Grant watched them go. Audrey was watching him watch them. "Thank you for coming," she said. She said it differently from how she'd said it at the hospital, when it had been formal and careful. This was just direct, one person to another. "Thank you for the invitation," he said, which was also just direct. She smiled. It was a real one, the kind that reached where smiles are supposed to reach, and it sat funny on her face, that small smile he'd seen in November, not better or worse, just truer. She extended her hand. He looked at it for a moment, then shook it. "Friend," she said. "Something like that," he said. She laughed, the real one, the short, surprised one, and then someone from the Foundation's events team appeared at her elbow with a question, and she was pulled into the logistics of the evening, and Grant was left in the entrance of the Sterling Crown Hotel on a Tuesday night in December with the chandeliers above him and the marble beneath his feet, and the memory of November not gone but changed in quality, the way memories do when enough real things happen afterward. He found his table round 8, near the windows, seats also assigned to Sylvie Park and her husband, Rob Ing, a Foundation board member he'd spoken to once on a call, and 2 people from the new employer partnership program who turned out to be interesting in the specific way of people who do practical work and talk about it without inflation. The dinner was good, not extravagant, not performing at being good, just actually good. The way food is when someone made real decisions about it, instead of defaulting to what looked impressive. Piper ate everything on her plate, including the things she didn't recognize, which she identified afterward as risotto, and declared acceptable with the generosity of someone who had been braced for much worse. Maisie at the adjacent table caught Piper's eye during the salad course and made a face about something on her plate, and Piper made a face back. Yes, he'd intervened, and this silent conversation continued at intervals throughout the meal, while both their parents observed it with the specific private warmth of adults watching children be children without knowing they're being watched. At 8:15, Audrey stood at the front of the room. She didn't use notes. She talked about the Foundation, its history, what it had done, what it had failed to do. She talked about the November Gala, without drama, without the phrasing that comes from something being prepared by a communications team. She said that an event had occurred that evening that she was not proud of. She said that she had made a judgment about a person based on how he was dressed and had acted on that judgment in a way that was public and wrong, and had nearly cost her daughter something irretrievable. She did not name Grant. She did not look at him, either, for the duration of this part, which he understood as consideration. She talked about what she'd learned from it not as a lesson in the tidy narrative sense, but in the messier actual sense, that her fear for Maisie had not made her smart. It had made her fast and smart were not the same thing, and she'd confused them. That the person she'd thrown out of the room had known something she hadn't known because he'd lived things she hadn't lived. And the measure she'd used to dismiss him had been entirely the wrong measure. And she'd known this intellectually for years and discovered that knowing something and acting on it were also not the same thing. The room was quiet in a way that rooms are quiet when what's being said is true and the people listening know it. She talked about the Family Forward initiative for 12 minutes, with specificity, not statistics, but actual families. Case studies with identifying details removed, the shapes of lives, the mechanics of the problems, the way a single unexpected expense could destabilize something that had taken years to assemble. She had gotten this material. Grant knew partly from him, and partly from Sylvie Park, and partly from the case managers they'd hired, who had insisted on being heard during the program design phase. When she finished, the room applauded, not the polished, reflexive applause of a gala crowd performing appreciation. Something with more weight in it. Grant did not applaud. He sat with his hands around his water glass and looked at the front of the room where Audrey was gathering herself. The way speakers do when they've said what they needed to say and are coming back to themselves. And he thought about the sidewalk in November and what it had and hadn't cost him. And about the kitchen on Delwood Avenue with 2 mugs of coffee on the table. And about Piper at the choir concert in her careful professional not-wave. He thought about Carla, which he didn't do in public, which happened sometimes when his guard was less organized than usual. The way grief does not announced, ceremonial, just present, the way weather is present. She would have liked Maisie. And then he picked up his water glass and drank it, and Rob Ings beside him said something about the risotto, and the evening continued. After dinner, Piper's shoes had, as predicted, become a problem. She found Grant near the windows, with her shoes in her hand, and one sock slightly dirty from the marble floor, and she held them up as evidence of something without saying what. "Told you," he said. "You told me once," she said. "That's not the same as being right. It's somewhat the same." She sat in the empty chair beside him and rubbed the bottom of her foot. "Maisie wants to know if we can go to the stable before the 8-week thing is up. Like just to see Ptolemy, not to ride. That's up to her mother and her doctor. She knows that. She wants to know if we can go too when she's allowed." Grant looked across the room to where Maisie was, sitting with a foundation board member who appeared to be telling her something she was finding politely tedious. Her expression the specific arrangement of a child who is well-mannered enough not to show boredom, but not quite experienced enough to fully conceal it. "Yeah," he said. "We can go." Piper put her shoes back on with the determination of someone who was going to see this bad decision through to the end, and they sat together in the chairs by the windows for a while, the way they sat on the porch at home, on warm evenings not saying much, just present in the same space, the particular comfort of 2 people who don't need the silence filled. Audrey found them there, 20 minutes later, when the event was winding toward its close, and the catering staff had begun the quiet work of clearing tables. She came and sat in the 3rd chair without asking, which Grant noticed the particular ease of someone who has stopped performing comfort and arrived at something more like actual comfort. "How are the shoes?" she said to Piper. "Fine," said Piper with feeling. Maisie does the same thing. Picks something beautiful and regrets it by the salad course. Piper looked at Audrey with a reassessment happening visibly behind her eyes, the updating of a file, new information being incorporated. "Did you used to do that too?" she asked. Audrey thought about it. "Still do sometimes," she said. "It's an optimism problem. You think the shoes will be different this time. And they never are. They never are." She paused. "You learn to pack flats in your bag. That's a good idea," Piper said. "It took me 30 years to have it." Piper nodded seriously, absorbing this as genuine advice, which it was. Grant was watching this exchange with the quiet attention of a man who collects things he doesn't have words for. The way Piper leaned slightly toward Audrey during the shoe conversation, the ease of it, The naturalness of two people who had no obvious reason to be at ease with each other, finding that they were. He thought about what it meant that his daughter was leaning toward someone new, and whether he was supposed to feel a particular way about it, and found that mostly what he felt was something he didn't have a precise name for, not relief, happiness exactly, just a sense of space where something had been that had been closed for a long time. He was careful with that feeling. He didn't examine it too directly. Some things stayed truer when you didn't look at them straight on. They were among the last to leave. Maisie had fallen asleep, sitting up in her chair at table 7, which Audrey had discovered at 9:40, and which Maisie had deeply denied for 30 seconds before the evidence became undeniable. She was embarrassed about this in the specific way of children who want to be treated as older than they are, and she went through the process of putting on her coat with the dignity of someone who had definitely not just been asleep in public. Piper tied her shoelaces, the shoes, in a final act of betrayal, had developed a loose lace and pulled on her own coat, and they stood in the entrance foyer of the Sterling Crown, the four of them, in the particular moment between a place and leaving it. Same time next year? Maisie said to no one specifically, to all of them. You'll be back on Ptolemy by then, Piper said, and you'll be completely insufferable about it. I'm already insufferable about it, Maisie said pleasantly. Grant looked at Audrey. She was looking at the marble floor, the specific spot near the staircase, where Maisie had gone down in November, and then she looked up and found him looking at her, and neither of them said anything about it, because nothing needed to be said. The room was what it was, and what had happened, and what was here now, and all of those things could be true simultaneously without any of them being the most important one. Drive safe, she said. You too, he said. Piper said goodbye to Maisie in the specific way they said goodbye to each other, not dramatically, not with the embellishments of children who have seen too many farewell scenes in movies. Just, see you. And Maisie's, see you. Grant and Piper walked through the marble doors and onto the sidewalk, and the city in December was cold and lit up and indifferent in its usual way, and his car was 2 blocks away in the same lot as before, because he hadn't seen any reason to change it. They walked. Piper put her hands in her coat pockets. Dad, she said. Yeah, that was a good night. He thought about all the parts of it, the dinner, Audrey at the front of the room saying true things, without notes, the shoes, Maisie asleep in her chair, the marble floor, and everything it had been, and everything it wasn't anymore. Yeah, he said. It was. They turned the corner off the main boulevard, and the hotel disappeared behind them, and the street ahead was ordinary, a bodega with its lights on, a couple walking a dog, a car idling at a red light, and they walked through it toward the Impala, dented quarter panel, with its dented quarter panels and its absent air freshener. And Grant found his keys, and Piper got in the passenger side and immediately put her feet on the dashboard, which he'd told her not to do approximately 400 times. He looked at her feet on the dashboard. He didn't say anything. He started the car. The risotto was good, Piper said. It was, he agreed. I'm going to learn how to make it. It'll probably be terrible the first few times. Most things are, but then it'll be good. Usually, he said. He pulled out of the lot. The city moved past the windows, and Piper talked about the risotto and the horse, and what she thought Maisie's actual opinion of Ptolemy was underneath the named scar bravado, and several other things that he answered in their turn. The radio stayed off, because the night had been loud enough, and this was the good quiet now, the one that came after. He drove them home to Delwood Avenue. The porch light was on because he'd left it on, and the spider plant was visible through the front window, still alive out of stubbornness. And the street was the street. It always was narrow and familiar and exactly the right size for the life that happened in it. Grant parked and cut the engine. He sat for a moment. You okay? Piper asked. He looked at the house. He looked at his daughter. Yeah, he said. I am. And it was true in the way that true things sometimes surprised you, not all at once, but in the quiet way that something that had been crooked for a long time finally settles into level position, and you notice it not because of what changed, but because of how ordinary it feels. He got out of the car. He unlocked the front door. He held it open for Piper, who went through first and went directly to the kitchen to look for something to eat, because she always came home hungry, regardless of how recently she'd eaten. which was a thing about her he had stopped trying to understand and simply accepted as a feature of who she was. He locked the door behind them. The house was warm. Outside, December was doing its thing, and the porch light held its small circle against the dark, and everything on Delwood Avenue was exactly as it had been when they left, which was the point of a place like this, not exciting, not grand, just there. Still there. January arrived without ceremony. The holidays had come and gone the way they did on Delwood Avenue quietly, with a tree that Piper decorated with the accumulated ornaments of her entire life, including the ones from kindergarten that were frankly terrible and which she treated as sacred objects. Christmas morning, and a Christmas morning that started too early and ended with Grant falling asleep in the armchair one Saturday afternoon while Piper watched something on the tablet Mrs. Pacheco had lent her for the week. It was not a dramatic Christmas. It was not a sad one either. It was the kind of ordinary that Grant had spent years building deliberately. The way you build something load-bearing not for aesthetics but for function, because function was what got you through February. What was different this January, from every January before it, was small but observable. There were 2 more people in the orbit of Delwood Avenue than there had been in October. In the house, not yet in the daily texture of things, but present in the way that real presences are present in Piper's conversation, in Grant's phone, in the altered shape of his weeks. Maisie sent Piper a photograph on New Year's Day of Ptolemy, wearing what appeared to be a paper party hat, which the stable staff had apparently allowed, which Ptolemy appeared to be tolerating with the resigned dignity of an animal that has decided humans are simply like this. Piper showed it to Grant at the breakfast table, and he looked at it for a moment and said, "That horse has the patience of a saint." Piper sent this back to Maisie verbatim, and Maisie's response was, "Tell him that. He'll get smug." These were small things. Grant had learned over the years since Carla to pay attention to small things. Large things announced themselves. Small things were what actually built a life. The Family Forward Initiative launched its first operational pilot in January. 3 employer partnerships in the city's service and healthcare sectors, an emergency child care dispatch network covering 2 zip codes on the south side, a confidential case management line staffed by 3 full-time coordinators who had been hired not from nonprofit management backgrounds, but from the communities they were serving, which had been Grant's specific insistence and Sylvie Park's specific implementation. The pilot was imperfect in the way that first versions of real things are imperfect. The dispatch network had a gap between 6 and 8 a.m. that took 3 weeks to identify and another 2 to patch. One of the employer partnerships stalled over liability language in the agreement and required 2 additional rounds of negotiation. The case management line was under-resourced in its first month, logging more calls than projected, which was the best possible problem to have, and also an immediate logistical challenge. Grant was on a video call with Sylvie Park at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday evening, when the early morning gap in the dispatch network first surfaced, and he looked at the data she was sharing and said, "That's the shift change window. Healthcare workers coming off nights, service workers starting earlies. That's the exact window where coverage breaks down." Sylvie was already writing. "You knew this would happen. I suspected it. It's the same window that got me 3 times in the first year after Carla died." He looked at the screen. "You need a dedicated early morning coordinator. Someone whose only job is that window. Budget, I know." He thought for a moment. "Talk to the hospital partnership first. They have the most night shift employees in the program. If it's their workers calling at 6 a.m., they have a vested interest in covering that slot." Sylvie made a note. She looked at him over her reading glasses. "You ever think about doing this full-time?" "No," he said, immediately, and without consideration. "Why not?" He thought about the warehouse, about the inventory spreadsheets, about the lunch break he took at the same picnic table every day unless it was raining, about the specific unremarkable rhythm of work that expected nothing from him except that he do it correctly. "Because I'm useful to you precisely because I don't do this full-time," he said. "The moment I'm inside the institution, I start thinking like the institution." Sylvie considered this for a long moment. "That's either very wise or very convenient." "Both," she said. "Probably both." Audrey called on a Thursday in late January at 7 in the evening, which had become a loose pattern, not scheduled, not regular enough to be expected, but frequent enough that Grant recognized the time slot. The board reviewed the pilot data, she said, and they want to expand it. 12 zip codes, 4 new employer partnerships, a second case management team. She paused. By April, Grant was quiet for a moment. That's fast. Sylvie's going to push back on the timeline. She already did, in writing, with charts. Audrey's voice had a dryness in it that he'd come to recognize as her particular brand of humor not performed, just resident, surfacing in the gaps between the professional manner. I told her she was right, and we were doing it in June instead. You overruled your own board. It's my foundation. It's your foundation's board. Grant. He could hear her shifting position, the way she did when she was settling into a conversation rather than conducting it. None. You're going to tell me to be careful about moving too fast and losing the integrity of the program. I was going to ask how Maisie is doing, he said. A pause. She had her 6-week follow-up Tuesday, Audrey said, and her voice changed in the way it always changed when it arrived at Maisie. Softer, exactly Audrey didn't soften in the way that word was usually meant. More honest, maybe. More direct. Dr. Vasquez cleared her for light activity. She can go back to the stable next week. Piper will be pleased to hear that. Maisie has already texted her. Then Piper knows and didn't tell me, which means she's saving it for maximum impact. Audrey laughed. Does she do that? She's 8. She's learning to manage information. That's either very alarming or very impressive. Both, Grant said. Probably both. There was a pause on the line, the comfortable kind, and then Audrey said, Can I ask you something? You're going to regardless, that's fair. Another pause, shorter, the kind before something real. Are you okay, actually? Not with the program or Maisie's appointments or any of it. Are you okay? Grant set down the mug he'd been holding. He looked at the kitchen wall, at the spot where Piper had drawn a horse on the paint in purple marker when she was 4, and which he'd never fully covered because he kept forgetting to buy the right shade of white and had eventually stopped trying. Days, he said. What about the other days? He was quiet for a moment. The other days I make dinner and help with homework and take out the trash, he said. Same as the okay days. Just heavier. Does it help? She asked. Talking about it? Not always. He looked at the horse on the wall. But it doesn't hurt. She seemed to accept not as an answer she'd been hoping for, but as an honest one, which in his experience she valued over hope. I'm working on something, she said. Not for the foundation. She stopped. That came out wrong. Not for you as in a gift. I don't mean... It's a resource, she said. For parents. Specifically single parents who've had significant losses. A network peer support, run by people who've been through it. Not by therapists with clipboards, though those are available too, if someone wants them. I've been talking to a woman named Renee who runs something similar in Portland, and she's been helping us design it. Grant said nothing for a long moment. It's not for me, Audrey said, slightly too quickly. I mean, it's not targeted at you, specifically. It would be a program component. Audrey. What? Thank you, he said. The line was quiet. You don't have to use it, she said. I know. I kept thinking about what you said. The other days. And I thought if there was something, he said again. Thank you. The stable on a Saturday in February was cold enough that your breath showed. Yeah. And the horses moved in that compact energy conserving way that animals move when the temperature drops. And the effort of being large requires more management than usual. Ptolemy was in fine form. Yes, he'd intervened. Maisie had been cleared for riding 2 weeks earlier and had spent those 2 weeks talking about coming back with the focused energy of someone who has been deprived of something important and intends to make up for lost time. She was on Ptolemy within 10 minutes of arriving, which her instructor observed with the expression of a person watching someone do something they've been advised not to rush, who has also dealt with Maisie long enough to know which battles are winnable. Piper stood outside the paddock fence with Grant, watching. She's going to push it, Piper said. She already is, Grant said. Ptolemy, to his credit, was behaving with unusual patience or unusual for him, which still included one sideways step and a moment of what the instructor diplomatically called opinionated behavior, but which looked, from the outside, like the horse briefly considering his options. Maisie spoke to him during this, and matter of fact, and he settled, which made Piper make a small sound. She's good at that, Piper said. Yeah, talking to stubborn things. Grant looked at her. Piper was watching Maisie with the kind of attention she reserved for things she was in the process of admiring. The subtle evaluation of someone who is updating her understanding of a person and finding the update favorable. There was something in it that Grant recognized, the recognition that someone you've chosen is worth having chosen, which was its own particular satisfaction. She is, he said. They watched the rest of the session from the fence, and afterward, Maisie came out of the paddock with her helmet listing and her boots muddy and the specific glow of someone who has done the thing they were waiting to do, and she walked straight to Piper and said, "Okay, so I might have pushed it a little. I saw Piper's ribs are fine. Luna is fine." She touched her side briefly. "Ptolemy is fine. My instructor has a feeling about it, but she'll get over it. Did she say you pushed it?" She said, and I quote, "Maisie, what did we discuss?" Which is different. Maisie pulled off her helmet. Because what did we discuss is a question, not a statement, which means there's room for interpretation. That is not what that means, Piper said. Technically. Fine, she grinned. But Luna is fine. Audrey was inside the stable office when Grant came in to get out of the cold for a few minutes, standing at the small window that overlooked the paddock with a coffee from the thermos she'd started bringing, after discovering that the stable's coffee situation was, in her word, bleak. She handed him a cup without being asked. He took it. They stood at the window and watched the girls outside Maisie demonstrating something to Piper about the way you approached a horse's flank. Piper listening with her full-body attention, both of them in their coats with their breath showing in the cold air. "She's going to be impossible about the Luna thing," Audrey said. "She already is. I made the mistake of not objecting to the name, which she's taken as institutional approval." Audrey drank her coffee. "I'm outnumbered in my own house by a 9-year-old and a scar. You were always going to lose that one." "I know," she paused. "I've been learning which ones to let go." He looked at her briefly. Yes, it was a significant thing for Audrey Westlake to say, and she said it without weight, which meant she'd arrived at it genuinely rather than performing the arrival. "How's the board situation?" he asked. "Managed." She turned her coffee cup. "I brought in 2 new members, people who've actually used social services at some point in their lives, which my previous board had not. There was some friction, and I reminded them that the Foundation's mandate had always been to help people in need, and that perhaps having people in need represented in our governance structure was not a radical departure from that mandate." She paused. "I was more diplomatic than that. Somewhat. Were you wrong?" "Then somewhat diplomatic is probably enough." She looked at him with the expression she sometimes had, the one that Grant had decided, after some consideration, was what Audrey Westlake looked like when she was simply present, without the management layer. "You never tell me I handled something well," she said. "You just tell me whether I was wrong. If you weren't wrong, that's the same thing." "It really isn't." He thought about it honestly. "You handled it well," he said. "Sounds sarcastic, Audrey." "What?" "You handled it well," he said, and looked at her directly, which was the thing that made it land as meant. "You pushed through something hard, and you did it because it was right, not because it was easy. That's handling it well." She held his gaze for a moment. "Thank you," she said. Quiet, unembellished. "You're welcome." Outside, Maisie had apparently convinced Piper to try approaching Ptolemy on a lead, which the instructor was supervising with the careful attention of someone who has seen every possible thing go wrong and intends for none of them to go wrong today. Piper was walking carefully, her posture radiating the specific alertness of someone who is not scared exactly, but is taking nothing for granted. And Ptolemy was cooperating with the minimal effort of an animal that has decided this particular person is acceptable. Ptolemy turned his large head and bumped his nose gently against Piper's shoulder. Piper startled. Then she looked at him. Then, slowly, she reached up and put her hand flat against the side of his face, and he didn't pull away. From the stable window, Grant watched his daughter's face do the thing it did when something reached her, the total drop of the careful expression, the real one underneath, unguarded and whole. He looked away before she could catch him looking. Some moments were not for witnessing. The February board meeting of the Westlake Children's Foundation was the first one Grant attended in person. He hadn't planned to. He'd been on the video calls, given his input, sent his marked-up documents to Sylvie, and considered that sufficient involvement. But Audrey had asked him to come to this one. Specifically, the expansion vote is on the agenda, and I want you in the room. And he had learned in the past several months that when Audrey asked for something specifically rather than generally, was a reason she hadn't explained and probably would explain if he asked, and also probably didn't need to. He went. The boardroom was on the 14th floor of a building in the financial district, glass-walled, overlooking the city in a way designed to communicate altitude in both the literal and metaphorical sense. The table was long enough to seat 12, and there were 11 board members plus Audrey at the head and Grant in a chair along the side wall, not at the table, which was his preference and which Audrey had not tried to argue him out of. He watched the meeting the way he watched most things, with attention and without performance. There were two board members who made him uneasy, not because they were bad people or even wrong in their instincts, because they spoke about the people, the foundation served in the specific abstracted way of people who have never been in the room with them. Cruel, just distant. The distance of people who had never needed to think about whether their family would be okay if they missed 2 shifts. The expansion vote came. There was a question about return on investment phrased carefully, buried in language about program efficacy and impact metrics, but a question about return on investment. Grant spoke from the side wall. He didn't ask permission. He said, "Can I address that?" The board member who'd asked a man named Carver, silver-haired, with the manner of someone who had been important for long enough that it no longer required effort, looked at Grant with the specific attention of someone recalibrating who is in the room. "Of course," Carver said in the tone of someone who is not certain they mean it. Grant talked for 4 minutes. Not about data, not about metrics, about the 6 a.m. coverage gap and what it looked like from the inside, the specific arithmetic of that hour. What it meant to be standing in a parking lot at 5:50 in the morning with a sick kid and a shift starting in 40 minutes and a case manager line that didn't open until 8. He talked about what that gap cost, not in program terms, in human terms. What it cost the parent, what it cost the kid, what it cost the employer who lost the shift anyway when the parent didn't show. What it cost the emergency room when the parent in desperation brought the kid there instead. He talked about how they'd closed the gap and what closing it had changed. Yet, and owned. When he stopped, the room was the particular quiet of people who have just received information that rearranged something they thought they already understood. Carver said, after a moment, "Who are you exactly?" "Community advisor," Grant said. "In what capacity?" "The capacity of someone who needed this program and didn't have it," Grant said, unkindly, not as a challenge, just as the most accurate answer available. The vote passed 11-0. Sylvie Park, across the table, caught Grant's eye and said nothing, which was its own kind of statement. Spring came in the way it comes to cities not gradually but in lurches, a warm week followed by cold. The trees confused about their own timing, the light changing before anything else did. By March, the worst of winter was over, and the paddock at Ridgecrest had thawed enough that the horses moved through it without the compressed, careful quality of cold weather movement. Piper had learned to lead a horse. She was working on something the instructor called contact, which apparently meant communicating through the lead rope in ways that required sensitivity. Grant privately doubted his own hands possessed, though he didn't say this. Maisie had her 8-week post-surgical clearance in March, and Dr. Vasquez told her that her heart was doing what a heart was supposed to do, which he said plainly, and she received with the dignified calm of someone who had been waiting to hear it for longer than 8 weeks. She cried in the car on the way home. Not for long. She stopped herself with the particular self-consciousness of a child who doesn't want her mother to see. And Audrey, yes, he'd intervened, who had been watching the road with the deliberateness of someone managing their own response to the same news, said nothing about it. They were halfway home when Maisie said, "Can we call Piper?" "We can text her," Audrey said. "Can we call? It's a school day, baby." "She's in class." A pause. After school, Audrey said. Maisie settled back in her seat and looked out the window at the city going by. "Yeah." "Do you ever think about what would have happened if he hadn't come back in?" Audrey kept her eyes on the road. It was a question she had thought about. She had thought about it in the particular way that parents think about things that almost happen, the nearness of it, the ordinary contingency of it. The fact that the difference between the way things went and the way they could have gone was a man, Tennessee, standing on a sidewalk, making a decision nobody would have blamed him for not making. She said. Maisie was quiet. I'm glad he did, Maisie said. Me too. Another silence, different from the first. He's going to be around for a while, right? Maisie said. It's not going to stop. Audrey glanced at her daughter. Maisie shrugged, with the careful nonchalance of a child who has a real reason and is deciding how much of it to show. Piper needs someone too, she said. Not just for her. She stopped, tried again. She doesn't have a mom. She stopped again. I just think it would be good if it kept going. That's all. Audrey looked at the road. I think so too, she said. The anniversary of the gala came in November, 1 year on. Grant noticed the date the way he noticed most things, not dramatically, but with a quiet awareness, the way you note an anniversary that has no official status, but that your memory has filed as significant regardless. He was making Piper's lunch when it occurred to him. Yes, he'd intervened, and he stood at the counter for a moment with the bread in his hand and thought about the man he'd been the previous November, the man who'd parked 2 blocks away and walked through the cold because the valet made him uncomfortable, who'd stood at the back of that room and watched his daughter practice, not waving, who'd looked at a girl by the staircase for 4 seconds and made a decision his body already knew how to make. He thought about all the things that had happened to that man in the past year. It was a strange inventory to take in a kitchen on a Tuesday morning, and he didn't take it for long. He put the bread in the bag. He folded the note. You're going to do great today. Dad, because it was a math test day, and Piper was better at math than she thought she was, but didn't know it yet. And the notes on hard days were different from the notes on regular days. He closed the lunchbox. His phone showed a text from Audrey, sent at 7:15, 1 year. He typed back, yeah. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. For what it's worth, I'm glad you came back in. He looked at this for a moment. He typed, I know. Then after a second, me too. The second gala was not at the Sterling Crown. Audrey had made that decision in August without consulting anyone and announced it to the events team as a fact rather than a suggestion. She'd chosen a smaller venue, the atrium of the city's Natural History Museum, which had a glass ceiling and stone floors and the bones of things that had lasted longer than anything in the room would last, which she found appropriate without being able to say exactly why. Grant came. He brought Piper, who wore the green dress again, and different shoes, chosen with the foreknowledge of what happened to bad shoe choices, which was evidence of learning that Grant privately considered one of the better developments of the past year. Maisie met them at the entrance. She was taller than she'd been in November Children, did that, grew in the specific obvious onsies you noticed way that happened when you saw them regularly, and she was wearing her butterfly clip and a dress the color of a storm cloud that she'd chosen herself, and which was, Grant thought, a good choice. You look nice, Piper told her. So do you, Maisie said. Better shoes this time? Much better, Piper said with feeling. They went in together, the way they had started going into most things side by side, already mid-conversation, carrying forward something that had begun months ago and showed no sign of needing a reason to continue. Audrey was at the entrance of the atrium, talking to the museum's director, and when she saw Grant, she finished what she was saying and came over. She was in a deep green dress, different from anything she had worn to the November gala, with no jewelry, except one simple thing at her wrist, and her hair down, and she looked like herself, in the way she'd looked in the waiting room at Mercy General, and in the kitchen at Delwood Avenue, which was a different self from the gala version of the previous year. Not better or worse, but truer. Hi, she said. Hi, he said. They stood at the entrance of the museum atrium, with the city visible through the glass ceiling above them and the sound of 200 people talking moving through the stone space like something alive. She said, a year ago, I had you thrown out of a room. I remember. And now you're... She looked at the atrium, at Piper and Maisie disappearing into the crowd together, at the foundation's new banner above the entrance arch. Here, he agreed. She looked at him. I've been thinking about what I want to say tonight, when I speak. There's a version of this where I tell the whole story, what happened, what I did, what it cost, what it changed. Name you specifically. Full accountability, public record. And the other version? The other version is what I said at the December Gala. What happened without specifics? Let the program speak for itself. Grant considered. Which one do you want to give? I want to give the one that does the most good, she said. I don't know which one that is. He thought about it, honestly, the way she'd asked him, not as a performance of consideration, but actually thinking it through the way he thought through things that mattered. The story with my name in it makes it about me and you, he said. The story about what the program actually does makes it about the families using it. He looked at her. You already know which one does more good. She was quiet for a moment. You're right, she said. I know. She looked at him with the expression that was its own language, now the one that meant she was filing something, updating something, that something he'd said had landed in a place where she'd feel it later, when she wasn't in a room full of people. Grant, she said. Yeah, I want you to know she stopped. Try it again, in the way she did when the first version wasn't honest enough. You did. Not just at the gala, all of it. The kitchen, the hospital, the board meeting, the program. I want you to know that it mattered, that you changed something real. She paused. The way the press release says, the actual way. He looked at the glass ceilings, where the November sky was dark and the city lights made their own constellations against it. You changed something too, he said. She looked at him. You made a mistake, and you didn't hide it, he said. You said it out loud in a room full of people who were watching and waiting to judge it. And then you did the harder thing, which is you actually fixed something because of it. He paused. That's not nothing. That's actually rare. Audrey looked away, and he saw very briefly, before it was managed the thing underneath the composure, the real response to something said plainly. My communications team would argue. I handled it very well strategically, she said. Your communications team wasn't there when you said yes, in my kitchen, when I asked if you judged me by my suit. She was quiet. That's what made it real, he said. After the speech, the right version, the one about the program, about the families, about the gap at 6 a.m. that had been closed, and what closing it had meant, the atrium filled with the sound of people who had been moved by something and were trying to figure out what to do with it, which was its own kind of success. Grant found Piper at a table near the far wall, deep in conversation with Maisie, and a woman Grant didn't recognize who turned out to be Renee, the woman from Portland who'd helped design the peer support network, and who was telling them both something about horses, apparently, because Maisie had the expression of someone hearing their own life described back to them by a stranger and finding it unexpectedly validating. He stood nearby and didn't interrupt. Sylvie Park came to stand beside him, coffee in hand, reading glasses on her head, where she always put them when she wasn't reading, but might need to. 42 families enrolled in the first month of the expanded program, she said. He said, I read your report. 68 by month 2. Sylvie, I'm just saying. I know what you're saying. She drank her coffee. The early morning coordinator position, the one you suggested, she got a call last Tuesday at 6:15 from a woman who'd been awake all night trying to figure out what to do with her sick kid and her shift. She said that when someone actually picked up the phone, she cried. Sylvie paused. Sad crying. The other kind. Grant looked at his daughter across the atrium, at the way she was laughing at something Renee had said, at the way Maisie was laughing too, at the glass ceiling above them, with its dark sky and its city lights. He said, they stood together in the good quiet for a moment. Sylvie said most people, when they give an organization, something like what, you gave us the knowledge, the credibility, the real-world design input, they want something back. Recognition, status, an advisory title on the letterhead. I have an advisory title, Grant said. Community advisor, letterhead, and no salary and no office. I have a perfectly good office at the hardware supply warehouse. Sylvie looked at him over her glasses, which she'd pulled down at some point. You're a strange man, Grant Holloway. I've been told that. It's a compliment. I know, he said. Later, late enough that the atrium had thinned to the last 24 people, the caterers moving through with the quiet efficiency of people who have done this 1,000 times. Piper half asleep in a chair with her good shoes still on because she'd made a decision and was seeing im Zieflet. Believe through Grant stood at the edge of the glass ceiling's reflection on the stone floor. He wasn't thinking about anything in particular. This was something he'd gotten better at over the past year. in the same way he'd gotten better at other things, letting a moment be what it was without making it carry more than it could hold. Audrey came to stand beside him. Not close, not distant. Just beside. They stood in the quiet that had developed between them over the past year, the kind that was its own form of communication, not absence of words, but the presence of comfort with their absence. "Thank you for tonight," she said. "I didn't do anything tonight." "You were here," she said. "That's still something." He thought about Piper telling Maisie months ago, he shows up. When he can. He thought about how the simplest things were usually the truest ones, and how the truest things were usually the hardest to learn. "Yeah," he said. "It is." Maisie came to find them then awake despite appearances, because Maisie had always been alert to the rooms her mother was in, which was something the two of them shared, whether they knew it or not. She stood between them and looked up at the glass ceiling. "You can see 3 stars," she said, "even with all the city lights." Grant looked up. She was right, 3, faint but real, visible through the glass between 2 cloud banks. "Ptolemy and—" "Maisie considered, Grant," she said decisively. Audrey looked at her daughter. "What?" Maisie said. He came back in. Grant kept his eyes on the ceiling for a moment. 3 stars, faint and urban, and not particularly remarkable, visible, because the cloud had moved and the angle was right, and someone had looked up at the right time. "Get your coat," he said. "It's late. The star is still there whether I'm looking at it or not," Maisie said. "True," he said. "Coat." She went to get it, untroubled, the way she was untroubled by most things that she'd already made her mind up about. Audrey was looking at the ceiling still. "She's not wrong," Audrey said. Grant agreed, she usually isn't. He went to get Piper, who woke without protest and stood and put her coat on and leaned against his arm for a moment in the half-asleep way, and he let her because she still would sometimes, and someday she wouldn't, and he had learned the hard way and the long way and finally the right way, that the things worth having were the ones you stayed present for. They said goodnight at the museum entrance, the 4 of them, in the cold air, with the city behind them and the glass ceilings 3 faint stars above. A dramatic goodbye, not a cinematic one. Just good night, see you. Drive safe, text me when you're home. The ordinary language of people who have moved from event to life, from occasion to something that continues without needing an occasion. Grant and Piper walked to the car. Piper held his arm because the good shoes were, finally, having their last conversation with her feet. "She named a star after you," Piper said. "I heard. How does it feel?" He thought about it. "Strange," he said. "Good strange or bad strange?" "Just strange." He unlocked the car. "Get in before you lose a shoe." She got in. He started the engine. The heater came on with the rattle it had been making since October that he kept meaning to look at. He drove. The city was exactly as it always was, enormous and indifferent, and full of lives he would never know anything about, each one carrying its own weight, its own losses, its own ordinary Tuesday mornings and hard Februaries and small improbable moments of something like grace. He's one of those lives, and Piper was one. And 3 blocks behind him, Audrey and Maisie were pulling out of the museum parking structure and going home to their house. And somewhere in the city, a case manager had answered a phone at 6 a.m., and someone had cried the other kind of crying. These things were all true at the same time. None of them needed the others to be valid. But altogether, in the way that altogether happened, not in a single moment, but across months and decisions and kitchens and hospital, waiting rooms and paddocks and parking lots, they had made something that had not existed before. 2 families where there had been 2 separate loneliness. A program where there had been a gap. A man who had stopped running toward things, deciding on a sidewalk in November that some things were still worth running toward. Grant turned onto Delwood Avenue. The porch light was on because he'd left it on, because he always left it on. He parked. He sat for a moment. Piper was already asleep, her head against the window, her coat pulled up, her good shoes having done their worst, finally still. He sat in the quiet of his own life and felt the weight of it, which was the right weight, the honest one, the one made of everything that had actually happened, rather than everything he'd feared or hoped or planned. Then he got out. He opened the back door. He lifted his daughter carefully, and she put her arms around his neck without waking. And he carried her up the front steps of the house on Delwood Avenue and managed the door and carried her as inside and left the lights off because he knew where everything was. He always had.